The Kingdom of God is Within You, by Leo Tolstoy. Part 2, Chapter 4. Now I will speak of another putative comprehension of Christianity, which interferes with the correct comprehension of it, the scientific comprehension. The churchmen regard as Christianity that conception of it which they have formed, and this comprehension of Christianity they regard as the one indubitably true one. The men of science regard as Christianity only what the different churches have been professing, and, assuming that these professions exhaust the whole significance of Christianity, they recognize it as a religious teaching which has outlived its time. To have it made clear how impossible it is with such a view to understand the Christian teaching, we must form an idea of the place which the religions in general and Christianity in particular have in reality occupied in the life of humanity, and of the significance which is ascribed to religion by science. As an individual man cannot live without having a definite idea of the meaning of his life, and always, though often unconsciously, conforms his acts to this meaning which he ascribes to his life, even so aggregates of men living under the same conditions. Nations cannot help but have a conception about the meaning of their collective life and the activity resulting therefrom. And as an individual, entering into a new age invariably changes his comprehension of life, and a grown man sees its meaning in something else than in what a child sees it, so an aggregate of people, a nation, inevitably, according to its age, changes its comprehension of life and the activity which results from it. The difference between the individual and the whole of humanity in this respect consists in this, that while the individual in the determination of the comprehension of life, proper to the new stage of life into which he enters, and in the activity which arises from it, makes use of the indications of men who have lived before him and who have already passed through the period of life upon which he is entering, humanity cannot have these indications, because it all moves along an untrodden path. And there is no one who can tell how life is to be understood, and how one is to act under the new conditions into which it is entering, and in which no one has lived before. And yet, as a married man with children cannot continue to understand life as he understood it when he was a child, so humanity cannot, in connection with all the various changes which have taken place, the density of the population, and the established intercourse between the nations, and the improvement of the means for struggling against nature, and the accumulation of science, continue to understand life as before, but must establish a new concept of life, from which should result the activity which corresponds to that new condition into which it has entered or is about to enter. To this demand responds the peculiar ability of humanity to segregate certain people who give a new meaning to the whole of human life, a meaning from which results the whole new activity which is different from the preceding one. The establishment of the new life conception, which is proper for humanity under the new conditions into which it is entering, and of the activity resulting from it, is what is called religion. And so religion, in the first place, is not, as science thinks, a phenomenon which at one time accompanied the evolution of humanity and later became obsolete, but is a phenomenon always inherent in the life of humanity, and is in our time as inevitably inherent in humanity as at any other time. In the second place, religion is always a determination of the activity of the future and not of the past, and so it is obvious that the investigation of past phenomena can in no way include the essence of religion. The essence of every religious teaching does not consist in the desire to express the forces of nature symbolically, or in the fear of them, or in the demand for the miraculous, or in the external forms of its manifestation, as the men of science imagine. The essence of religion lies in the property of men prophetically to foresee and point out the path of life over which humanity must travel, in a new definition of the meaning of life, from which also results anew the whole future activity of humanity. This property of foreseeing the path on which humanity must travel is in a greater or lesser degree common to all men, but there have always, at all times, been men in whom this quality has been manifested with particular force. And these men expressed clearly and precisely what was dimly felt by all men, and established a new comprehension of life, from which resulted an entirely new activity, for hundreds and thousands of years. We know 3 such conceptions of life. 2 of them humanity has already outlived, and the third is the one through which we are now passing in Christianity. There are three, and only three, such conceptions, not because we have arbitrarily united all kinds of life conceptions into these three, but because the acts of men always have for their base one of these three life conceptions, because we cannot understand life in any other way than by one of these three means. The three life conceptions are these: the first, the personal or animal; the second, the social or the pagan; and the third, the universal or the divine. According to the first life conception, man's life is contained in nothing but his personality. The aim of his life is the gratification of the will of this personality. According to the second life conception, man's life is not contained in his personality alone, but in the aggregate and sequence of personalities, in the tribe, the family, the race, the state. The aim of life consists in the gratification of the will of this aggregate of personalities. According to the third life conception, man's life is contained neither in his personality, nor in the aggregate and sequence of personalities, but in the beginning and source of life, in God. These three life conceptions serve as the foundation of all past and present religions. The savage recognizes life only in himself, in his personal desires. The good of his life is centered in himself alone. The highest good for him is the greatest gratification of his lust. The prime mover of his life is his personal enjoyment. His religion consists in appeasing the divinity in his favor and in the worship of imaginary personalities of gods who live only for personal ends. A pagan, a social man, no longer recognizes life in himself alone, but in the aggregate of personalities, in the tribe, the family, the race, the state, and sacrifices his personal good for these aggregates. The prime mover of his life is glory. His religion consists in the glorification of the heads of unions, of eponyms, ancestors, kings, and in the worship of gods, the exclusive protectors of his family, his race, his nation, his state. 20. The man with the divine life conception no longer recognizes life to consist in his personality or in the aggregate of personalities, in the family, the race, the people, the country, or the state, but in the source of the everlasting, immortal life in God, and to do God's will he sacrifices his personal and domestic and social good. The prime mover of his religion is love, and his religion is the worship in deed and in truth of the beginning of everything of God. The whole historical life of humanity is nothing but a gradual transition from the personal, the animal life conception, to the social, and from the social to the divine. The whole history of the ancient nations, which lasted for thousands of years and which came to a conclusion with the history of Rome, is the history of the substitution of the social and the political life conception for the animal, the personal. The whole history since the time of imperial Rome and the appearance of Christianity has been the history of the substitution of the divine life conception for the political, and we are passing through it even now. It is this last life conception and the Christian teaching which is based upon it and which governs our whole life and lies at the foundation of our whole activity, both the practical and the theoretical, that the men of so-called science, considering it in reference to its external signs only, recognize as something obsolete and meaningless for us. This teaching, which, according to the men of science, is contained only in its dogmatic part, in the doctrine of the Trinity, the redemption, the miracles, the church, the sacraments, and so forth, is only one out of a vast number of religions which have arisen in humanity, and now, having played its part in history, is outliving its usefulness, melting in the fight of science and true culture. What is taking place is what in the majority of cases serves as a source of the coarsest human errors, men who are standing on a lower level of comprehension, coming in contact with phenomena of a higher order. Instead of making efforts to understand them, instead of rising to the point of view from which they ought to look upon a subject, judge it from their lower point of view, and that, too, with greater daring and determination the less they understand what they are talking about. For the majority of scientific men who view Christ's vital, moral teaching from the lower point of the social conception of life, this teaching is only a very indefinite, clumsy combination of Hindu asceticism, Stoical and Neoplatonic teachings. and utopian antisocial reveries, which have no serious significance for our time, and its whole meaning is centered in its external manifestations, in Catholicism, Protestantism, the dogmas, the struggle with the worldly power. In defining the significance of Christianity according to these phenomena, they are like deaf persons who should judge of the meaning and the worth of music according to the appearance of the motions which the musicians make. The result of it is this, that all these men, beginning with Kant, Strauss, Spencer, and Renan, who do not understand the meaning of Christ's sermons, who do not understand why they are uttered and for what purpose, who do not even understand the question to which they serve as an answer, who do not even take the trouble to grasp their meaning, if they are inimically inclined, deny outright the rationality of the teaching, but if they wish to be condescending to it, they correct it from the height of their grandeur, assuming that Christ wanted to say precisely what they have in mind, but did not know how to say it. They treat his teaching as, in correcting the words of an interlocutor, self-confident men generally speak to one whom they regard as standing below them. Yes, what you mean to say is this. This correction is always made in the sense of reducing the higher, divine life conception to the lower, social conception. People generally say that the moral teaching of Christianity is good, but exaggerated, that, in order that it should be absolutely good, we must reject from it what is superfluous, what does not fit in with our structure of life. For otherwise the teaching, which demands too much, which cannot be carried out, is worse than one which demands from men what is possible and in conformity with their strength, think and assert the wise interpreters of Christianity, repeating what was long ago affirmed and still is affirmed, and could not help but be affirmed, in relation to the Christian teaching, by those who, having failed to comprehend the teacher of it, crucified him, by the Jews. It turns out that before the judgment of the learned of our time, the Jewish law, a tooth for a tooth, and an eye for an eye, the law of just retaliation, which was known to humanity 5,000 years ago, is more useful than the law of love which 1,800 years ago was preached by Christ in place of this very law of justice. It turns out that everything which has been done by the men who comprehended Christ's teaching in a direct manner and lived in conformity with such a comprehension, everything which all true Christians, all Christian champions, have done, everything which now transforms the world under the guise of socialism and communism, is exaggeration of which it is not worthwhile to speak. Men who have been educated in Christianity for 18 centuries have convinced themselves in the persons of their foremost men, the scholars, that the Christian teaching is a teaching of dogmas, that the vital teaching is a misconception, an exaggeration, which violates the true legitimate demands of morality, which correspond to man's nature, and that the doctrine of justice, which Christ rejected and in the place of which he put his own teaching, is much more profitable for us. The learned consider the commandment of non-resistance to evil an exaggeration and even madness. If it be rejected, it would be much better, they think, without observing that they are not talking of Christ's teaching at all, but of what presents itself to them as such. They do not notice that to say that Christ's commandment about non-resistance to evil is an exaggeration is the same as saying that in the theory of the circle the statement about the equality of the radii of a circle is an exaggeration. And those who say so do precisely what a man, who did not have any conception as to what a circle is, would do if he asserted that the demand that all the points on the circumference should be equally distant from the center is an exaggeration. To advise that the statement concerning the equality of the radii in a circle be rejected or moderated is the same as not understanding what a circle is. To advise that the commandment about non-resistance to evil in the vital teaching of Christ be rejected or moderated means not to understand the teaching. And those who do so actually do not understand it at all. They do not understand that this teaching is the establishment of a new comprehension of life, which corresponds to the new condition into which men have been entering for these 1,800 years, and the determination of the new activity which results from it. They do not believe that Christ wanted to say what he did, or it seems to them that what he said in the Sermon on the Mount and in other passages he said from infatuation, from lack of comprehension, from insufficient development. Point 21. Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, For they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or wherewithal shall we be clothed? For after all these things do the Gentiles seek, for your heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Matthew 6 verse 25, 34. Sell that ye have, and give alms. Provide yourselves bags which wax not old, a treasure in the heavens that faileth not, where no thief approacheth, neither moth corrupteth. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Luke 12 verse 33, 34. Deny thyself, take up thy cross daily, and follow me. My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to do his work. Not my will be done, but thine, not what I want, but what thou wantest, and not as I want, but as thou wantest. The life is in this, not to do one's will, but the will of God. All these propositions seem to men who are standing on a lower life conception to be an expression of an ecstatic transport, which has no direct applicability to life. And yet these propositions just as strictly result from the Christian conception of life as the tenet about giving up one's labor for the common good, about sacrificing one's life in the defense of one's country, results from the social conception. Just as a man of the social life conception says to a savage, "Come to your senses, bethink yourself." The life of your personality cannot be the true life, because it is wretched and transitory. Only the life of the aggregate and of the sequence of personalities of the tribe, the family, the race, the state, is continued and lives, and so a man must sacrifice his personality for the life of the family, the state. Precisely the same the Christian teaching says to a man of the aggregate, of the social conception of life. Repent, mu epsilon alphan omicron epsilon tau epsilon, that is, bethink yourselves, or else you will perish. Remember that this carnal, personal life, which originated today and will be destroyed tomorrow, cannot be made secure in any way, that no external measures, no arrangement of it, can add firmness and rationality to it. Bethink yourselves and understand that the life which you live is not the true life. The life of the family, the life of society, the life of the state will not save you from ruin. The true, rational life is possible for man only in proportion as he can be a participant, not in the family or the state, but in the source of life, the Father, in proportion as he can blend his life with the life of the Father. Such indubitably is the Christian life comprehension, which may be seen in every utterance of the gospel. It is possible not to share this life conception. It is possible to reject it. It is possible to prove its inexactness and irregularity. But it is impossible to judge of the teaching without having first grasped the life conception from which it results. Still less possible is it to judge about a subject of a higher order from a lower point of view, to judge of the tower by looking at the foundation. But it is precisely this that the learned men of our time are doing. They do so because they abide in an error, which is like the one of the churchmen, the belief that they are in possession of such methods of the study of the subject that, as soon as these methods, called scientific, are used, there can be no longer any doubt as to the correctness of the comprehension of the subject under advisement. It is this possession of an instrument of cognition, which they deem infallible, that serves as the chief obstacle in the comprehension of the Christian teaching by unbelievers and so-called scientific men, by whose opinion the vast majority of unbelievers, the so-called cultured men, are guided. From this imaginary comprehension of theirs arise all the errors of the scientific men in respect to the Christian teaching, and especially two strange misconceptions which more than any other impede the correct comprehension of it. One of these misconceptions is this, that the Christian vital teaching is impracticable, and so is either entirely unobligatory, that is, need not be taken for a guide, or else must be modified and moderated to such an extent as to make it practicable in our society. Another misunderstanding is this, that the Christian teaching of love of God, and so the service of Him, is an obscure, mystical demand, which has no definite object of love, and so must give way to a more precise and comprehensible teaching about loving men and serving humanity. The first misconception about the impracticality of the teaching consists in this, that the men of the social comprehension of life, being unable to comprehend the method by means of which the Christian teaching guides men, and taking the Christian indications of perfection to be rules which determine life, think and say that it is impossible to follow Christ's teaching because a complete fulfillment of this teaching destroys life. If a man fulfilled what was preached by Christ, he would destroy his life, and if all men should fulfill it, the whole human race would come to an end, they say. If we care not for the morrow, for what we shall eat and drink and be clothed in, if we do not defend our lives, if we do not resist evil with force, if we give our lives for our friends and observe absolute chastity, no man, nor the whole human race, can exist, they think and say. And they are quite correct if we take the indications of perfection, as given by Christ, for rules which every man is obliged to carry out, just as in the social teaching everybody is obliged to carry out the rule about paying the taxes, about taking part in court, etc. The misconception consists in this, that Christ's teaching guides men in a different way from the way those teachings guide, which are based on a lower life conception. The teachings of the social life conception guide only by demanding a precise execution of the rules or laws. Christ's teaching guides men by indicating to them that infinite perfection of the Father in heaven, toward which it is proper for each man to strive voluntarily, no matter at what stage of perfection he may be. The misconception of people who judge about the Christian teaching from the social point of view consists in this, that they, assuming that the perfection pointed out by Christ may be attained completely, ask themselves, even as they question themselves, assuming that the social laws will be fulfilled, what will happen when all this shall be fulfilled? This assumption is false, because the perfection pointed out by Christ is infinite and can never be attained, and Christ gives His teaching with this in view, that complete perfection will never be attained, but that the striving toward complete, infinite perfection will constantly increase the good of men, and that this good can, therefore, be increased infinitely. Christ does not teach angels, but men who live an animal life, who are moved by it. And it is to this animal force of motion that Christ seems to apply a different force of the consciousness of divine perfection, and with this He directs the motion of life along the resultant of two forces. To assume that human life will go in the direction indicated by Christ is the same as assuming that a boatman, in crossing a rapid river and directing his boat almost against the current, will move in that direction. Christ recognizes the existence of both sides of the parallelogram, of both the eternal, indestructible forces of which man's life is composed, the force of the animal nature and the force of the consciousness of a filial relation to God. Without saying anything of the animal force, which, asserting itself, always remains equal to itself and exists outside of man's power, Christ speaks only of the divine force, calling man to recognize it in the highest degree, to free it as much as possible from what is retarding it, and to bring it to the highest degree of tension. In this liberation and increase of the force does man's true life, according to Christ's teaching, consist. The true life, according to the previous conditions, consisted in the execution of rules of the law. According to Christ's teaching, it consists in the greatest approach to the divine perfection, as pointed out to every man and inwardly felt by him, in a greater and ever greater approach toward blending our will with the will of God, a blending toward which a man strives, and which would be a destruction of life as we know it. Divine perfection is the asymptote of the human life, toward which it always tends and approaches, and which can be attained by it only at infinity. The Christian teaching seems to exclude the possibility of life only when men take the indication of the ideal to be a rule. It is only then that the demands put forth by Christ's teaching appear to be destructive of life. Without these demands, the true life would be impossible. Too much should not be demanded, people generally say, in discussing the demands of the Christian teaching. It is impossible to demand that we should not care for the future, as it says in the Gospel, All that we should do is not to care too much. It is impossible to give everything to the poor, but we should give a certain, definite part to them. It is not necessary to strive after chastity, but debauchery should be avoided. We must not leave our wives and children, but we should not be too much attached to them, and so forth. But to speak in this manner is the same as telling a man who is crossing a rapid river and who is directing his course against the current that it is impossible to cross the river by going against the current, but that to cross it he should row in the direction he wishes to go. Christ's teaching differs from previous teachings in that it guides men, not by external rules, but by the internal consciousness of the possibility of attaining divine perfection. And in man's soul, there are not moderated rules of justice and of philanthropy, but the ideal of the complete, infinite, divine perfection. Only the striving after this perfection deflects the direction of man's life from the animal condition toward the divine, to the extent to which this is possible in this life. In order to land where you wish, you must direct your course much higher up. To lower the demands of the ideal means not only to diminish the possibility of perfection, but to destroy the ideal itself. The ideal which operates upon people is not an invented one, but one which is born in the soul of every man. Only this ideal of the complete, infinite perfection acts upon people and moves them to activity. A moderated perfection loses its power to act upon men's souls. Christ's teaching only then has force when it demands full perfection, that is, the blending of God's essence, which abides in the soul of every man, with the will of God, the union of the Son and the Father. Only this liberation of the Son of God, who lives in every man, from the animal, and his approximation to the Father form life according to Christ's teaching. The existence of the animal in man, of nothing but the animal, is not the human life. Life according to the will of God alone is also not the human life. The human life is the resultant from the animal and the divine lives, and the more this resultant approaches the divine life, the more there is of life. Life, according to the Christian teaching, is a motion toward divine perfection. No condition, according to this teaching, can be higher or lower than another. Every condition, according to this teaching, is only a certain step, indifferent in itself, toward the unattainable perfection, and so in itself forms neither a greater nor a lesser degree of life. The increase of life, according to this teaching, is only an acceleration of motion toward perfection, and so the motion toward perfection of the publican Zacchaeus, of the harlot, of the robber on the cross, forms a higher degree of life than the immovable righteousness of the Pharisee. And so there can be no obligatory rules for this teaching. A man who stands on a lower step in moving toward perfection lives more morally and better performs the teaching than a man who stands on a much higher stage of morality, but who does not move toward perfection. In this sense, the lost sheep is dearer to the Father than one which is not lost. The prodigal son, the lost coin which is found again, are dearer than those which were not lost. The fulfillment of the teaching consists in the motion from oneself toward God. It is evident that for such a fulfillment of the teaching there can be no definite laws and rules. All degrees of perfection and all degrees of imperfection are equal before this teaching. No fulfillment of the laws constitutes a fulfillment of the teaching, and so, for this teaching there are and there can be no rules and no laws. From this radical distinction of Christ's teaching as compared with previous teachings, which are based on the social conception of life, there results the difference between the social and the Christian commandments. The social commandments are for the most part positive, prescribing certain acts, justifying men, giving them righteousness. But the Christian commandments, the commandment of love, is not a commandment in the strict sense of the word, but an expression of the very essence of the teaching. The 5 commandments of the Sermon on the Mount are all negative, and they all show only what men may not do at a certain stage of human development. These commandments are, as it were, signals on the infinite road to perfection, toward which humanity walks, signals of that stage of perfection which is possible at a given period of the development of humanity. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ has expressed the eternal ideal toward which it is proper for men to tend, and that degree of its attainment which can be reached even in our time. The ideal consists in having no ill will against anyone, in calling forth no ill will, in loving all, but the commandment below which, in the attainment of this ideal, it is absolutely possible not to descend, consists in not offending anyone with a word. And this forms the first commandment. The ideal is complete chastity, even in thought, the commandment which points out the degree of attainment below which, in the attainment of this ideal, it is absolutely possible not to descend, is the purity of the marital life, the abstaining from fornication. And this forms the second commandment. The ideal is not to care for the future, to live only in the present, the commandment which points out the degree of the attainment, below which it is absolutely possible not to descend, is not to swear, not to promise anything to men. And this is the third commandment. The ideal is never, under any condition, to make use of violence, the commandment which points out the degree below which it is absolutely possible not to descend is not to repay evil with evil, but to suffer insult, to give up one's cloak. And this is the fourth commandment. The ideal is to love our enemies, who hate us, the commandment which points out the degree of the attainment, below which it is possible not to descend, is to do no evil to our enemies, to speak well of them, to make no distinction between them and our fellow citizens. All these commandments are indications of what we are fully able not to do on the path of striving after perfection, of what we ought to work over now, of what we must by degrees transfer into the sphere of habit, into the sphere of the unconscious. But these commandments fail to form a teaching and do not exhaust it and form only one of the endless steps in the approximation toward perfection. After these commandments there must and will follow higher and higher ones on the path to perfection, which is indicated by the teaching. And so it is the peculiarity of the Christian teaching that it makes higher demands than those which are expressed in these commandments, but under no condition minimizes the demands, either of the ideal itself or of these commandments, as is done by people who judge the teaching of Christianity free from the standpoint of the social conception of life. Such is one misconception of the scientific men concerning the meaning and significance of Christ's teaching. The other, which flows from the same source, consists in the substitution of the love and service of men, of humanity, for the Christian demand for loving God and serving Him. The Christian teaching of loving God and serving Him, and only in consequence of this love and this service, of the love and service of our neighbor, appears obscure, mystical, and arbitrary to the men of science, and they completely exclude the demand of love of God and of serving Him, assuming that the teaching about this love of men, of humanity, is much more intelligible and firm and better grounded. The men of science teach theoretically that the good and sensible life is only the life of serving the whole of humanity, and in this alone do they see the meaning of the Christian teaching. To this teaching do they reduce the Christian teaching. For this their teaching do they seek a confirmation in the Christian teaching, assuming that their teaching and the Christian teaching are one and the same. This opinion is quite faulty. The Christian teaching, and that of the positivists, communists, and all the preachers of a universal brotherhood of men, which is based on the profitableness of such a brotherhood, have nothing in common among themselves, and differ from one another more especially in this, that the Christian teaching has firm, clear foundations in the human soul, while the teaching of the love of humanity is only a theoretical deduction from analogy. The teaching of the love of humanity alone has for its basis the social conception of life. The essence of the social conception of life consists in the transference of the meaning of our personal lives into the life of the aggregate of personalities, the tribe, the family, the race, the state. This transference has taken place easily and naturally in its first forms, in the transference of the meaning of life from the personality to the tribe, the family. But the transference to the race or nation is more difficult and demands a special education for it, and the transference of the consciousness to the state forms the limit of such a transference. It is natural for anyone to love himself, and every person loves himself without any special incitement, to love my tribe, which supports and defends me, to love my wife, the joy and helpmate of my life, my children, the pleasure and hope of my life, and my parents, who have given me life and an education, is natural, and this kind of love, though far from being as strong as the love of self, is met with quite frequently. To love one's race, one's nation, for the sake of oneself, of one's pride, though not so natural, is still to be met with. The love of one's nation, which is of the same race, tongue, and faith with one, is still possible, though this sentiment is far from being as strong as the love of self, or even of family and race. But the love of a country, like Turkey, Germany, England, Austria, Russia, is almost an impossible thing, and, in spite of the intensified education in this direction, is only assumed and does not exist in reality. With this aggregate, there ends for man the possibility of transferring his consciousness and of experiencing in this fiction any immediate sensation. But the positivists and all the preachers of a scientific brotherhood who do not take into consideration the weakening of the sentiment in proportion as the subject is widened continue the discussion theoretically along the same direction. If, they say, it was more advantageous for the personality to transfer its consciousness to the tribe, the family, and then to the nation, the state, it will be still more advantageous to transfer the consciousness to the whole aggregate of humanity, and for all to live for humanity, just as individuals live for the family, the state. Theoretically, it really comes out that way. Since the consciousness and the love of personality are transferred to the family, from the family to the race, the nation, the state, it would be quite logical for men to save themselves from struggle and calamities, which are due to the division of humanity into nations and states, most naturally to transfer their love to humanity. This would seem to be the most logical thing, and this is theoretically advocated by men who do not observe that love is a sentiment which one may have, but cannot preach, and that, besides, for love there must be an object, whereas humanity is not an object, but only a fiction. The tribe, the family, even the state, are not invented by men, but were formed naturally like a swarm of bees or ants and actually exist. A man who loves his family for the sake of his animal personality knows whom he loves: Anna, Mary, John, Peter, and so forth. A man who loves a race and is proud of it knows that he loves the whole race of the Guelphs or all the Ghibellines. He who loves the state knows that he loves France as far as the Rhine and the Pyrenees, and its capital, Paris, and its history, and so forth. But what does a man love when he loves humanity? There is the state, the nation. There is the abstract conception, man. But there is not, and there cannot be, a real conception of humanity. Humanity? Where is the limit of humanity? Where does it end and where does it begin? Does humanity stop short of a savage, an idiot, an alcoholic, an insane person? If we are going to draw a line of demarcation for humanity so as to exclude the lower representatives of the human race, where are we going to draw it? Are we going to exclude the Negroes, as the Americans do, and the Hindus, as some English do, and the Jews, as some do? But if we are going to include all men without exception, why include men only, and not the higher animals, many of whom stand higher than the lower representatives of the human race? We do not know humanity as an external object. We do not know its limits. Humanity is a fiction, and it cannot be loved. It would indeed be very convenient if men could love humanity just as they love the family. It would be very convenient, as the communists talk of doing, to substitute the communal for the competitive tendency of human activity, and the universal for the individual, so that every man may be for all, and all for every man, only there are no motives whatever for it. The positivists, the communists, and all the preachers of the scientific brotherhood preach the widening of that love which men have for themselves and for their families and for the state, so as to embrace all humanity, forgetting that the love which they advocate is the personal love, which, by spreading out thinner, could extend to the family, which, by spreading out still thinner, could extend to the natural country of birth, which completely vanishes as soon as it reaches an artificial state, as Austria, Turkey, England, and which we are not even able to imagine when we come to humanity, an entirely mystical subject. Man loves himself, his animal life, loves his family, loves even his country. Why should he not love also humanity? How nice that would be. By the way, this is precisely what Christianity teaches. Thus think the preachers of the positivist, communistic, socialistic brotherhoods. It would indeed be very nice, but it cannot be, because love which is based on the personal and the social conception of life cannot go beyond the state. The error of judgment consists in this, that the social life conception, on which is based the love of family and of country, is built on the love of personality, and that this love, being transferred from the personality to the family, the race, the nationality, the state, keeps growing weaker and weaker, and in the state reaches its extreme limit, beyond which it cannot go. The necessity for widening the sphere of love is incontestable, but at the same time this very necessity for its widening in reality destroys the possibility of love and proves the insufficiency of the personal, the human love. And here the preachers of the positivist, communistic, socialistic brotherhoods, to succor the human love, which has proved insufficient, propose the Christian love in its consequences alone and not in its foundations. They propose the love of humanity alone, without the love of God. But there can be no such love. There exists no motive for it. Christian love results only from the Christian conception of life, according to which the meaning of life consists in the love of God and in serving Him. By a natural progression, from the love of self to the love of family, of the race, of the nation, of the state, the social conception of life has brought men to the consciousness of the necessity for a love of humanity, which has no limits and blends with everything in existence, to something which evokes no sensations in man. It has brought them to a contradiction which cannot be solved by the social conception of life. Only the Christian teaching in all its significance, by giving a new meaning to life, solves it. Christianity recognizes the love of self and of the family and of the nation and of humanity, not only of humanity, but of everything living, of everything in existence. It recognizes the necessity for an endless widening of the sphere of love, but the object of this love it does not find outside of self, or in the aggregate of personalities, in the family, the race, the state, humanity, in the whole external world, but in oneself, in one's personality, which, however, is a divine personality, the essence of which is the same love, to the necessity of widening which the animal personality was brought, in saving itself from the consciousness of its perdition. The difference between the Christian teaching and what preceded it is this, that the preceding social teaching said, "Live contrary to your nature," meaning only the animal nature, subordinate it to the external law of the family, the society, the state. But Christianity says, "Live in accordance with your nature," meaning the divine nature, subordinating it to nothing, neither to your own, nor to anybody else's animal nature, and you will attain what you are striving after by subordinating your external nature to external laws. The Christian teaching takes man back to the primitive consciousness of self, not of self, the animal, but of self, God, the divine spark of self, the Son of God, of just such a God as the Father Himself, but included in an animal integument. And the recognition of self as this Son of God, whose chief quality is love, satisfies also all those demands for the widening of the sphere of love to which the man of the social conception of life was brought. There, with a greater and ever greater widening of the sphere of love for the salvation of the personality, love was a necessity and was applied to certain objects, self, the family, society, humanity, with the Christian conception of life. Love is not a necessity and is not adapted to anything, but is an essential quality of man's soul. Man does not love because it is advantageous for him to love this man or these men, but because love is the essence of his soul, because he cannot help loving. The Christian teaching consists in pointing out to man that the essence of his soul is love, that his good is derived not from the fact that he will love this or that man, but from the fact that he will love the beginning of everything, God, whom he recognizes in himself through love, and so will love everybody and everything. In this does the fundamental difference between the Christian teaching and the teaching of the positivists and of all the theorists of the non-Christian universal brotherhood consist. Such are the two chief misconceptions concerning the Christian teaching, from which originate the majority of the false opinions in regard to it. One is that, like the preceding teachings, Christ's teaching inculcates rules, which men are obliged to follow, and that these rules are impracticable. The other is that the whole significance of Christianity consists in the teaching about the advantageous cohabitation of humanity as one family, for which, without mentioning the love of God, It is necessary only to follow the rule of love toward humanity. The false opinion of the scientific men that the teaching of the supernatural forms the essence of the Christian teaching, and that Christ's vital teaching is impracticable, together with the misconception which arises from this false opinion, forms the second cause why Christianity is not understood by the men of our time. Chapter 5. There are many causes for the failure to comprehend Christ's teaching. One cause lies in this, that men assume that they understand the teaching when they decide, as the churchmen do, that it was transmitted to us in a supernatural manner, or, as the scientific men do, that they understand it, when they have studied a part of those external phenomena in which it is expressed. Another cause of a failure to comprehend lies in the misconceptions as to the impracticability of the teaching, and as to this, that it ought to give way to the teaching about the love of humanity. But the chief cause which has engendered all these misconceptions is this, that Christ's teaching is considered to be such as can be accepted, or not, without changing one's life. The men who are accustomed to the existing order of things, who love it and are afraid to change it, try to comprehend the teaching as a collection of revelations and rules which may be accepted without changing their lives. Whereas Christ's teaching is not merely a teaching about rules which a man may follow, but the elucidation of a new meaning of life, which determines the whole, entirely new activity of humanity for the period upon which it is entering. Human life moves, passes, like the life of the individual, and every age has its corresponding life conception, and this life conception is inevitably accepted by men. Those men who do not consciously accept the life conception proper for their age are brought to it unconsciously. What takes place with the change of views on life in the case of individuals takes place also with the change of the views on life in the case of nations and of all humanity. If a man with a family continues to be guided in his activity by a childish comprehension of life, his life will become so hard for him that he will involuntarily seek another comprehension of life, and will gladly accept the one which is proper for his age. The same is now taking place in our humanity in the transition from the pagan conception of life to the Christian, which is now going on. The social man of our time is brought by life itself to the necessity of renouncing the pagan conception of life, which is no longer proper for the present age of humanity, and of submitting to the demands of the Christian teaching, the truths of which, no matter how distorted and misinterpreted they may be, are still known to him and alone furnish a solution to those contradictions in which he is losing himself. If the demands of the Christian teaching seem strange and even perilous to the man of the social life conception, the demands of the social teaching anciently seemed just as incomprehensible and perilous to a savage, when he did not yet fully comprehend them and was unable to foresee their consequences. It is irrational for me to sacrifice my peace or even my life, says the savage, in order to defend something incomprehensible, intangible, conventional, the family, the race, the country, and, above all else, it is dangerous to give myself over to the disposition of a foreign power. But the time came when the savage, on the one hand, comprehended, however dimly, the significance of the social life, the significance of its prime mover, the public approval or condemnation, glory, on the other hand, when the sufferings of his personal life became so great that he no longer continued to believe in the truth of his former conception of life and accepted the social, the political teaching and submitted to it. The same now takes place with the social, the political man. It is irrational for me, says the social man, to sacrifice my good, the good of my family, my country, for the fulfillment of the conditions of some higher law, which demands from me the renunciation of the most natural and the best sentiments of love for myself, my family, my country, and, above all, it is dangerous to reject the security of life, which is given by the political structure. But the time comes when, on the one hand, the dim consciousness in his soul of a higher law of love for God and for his neighbor, and, on the other, the sufferings which arise from the contradictions of life, compel him to reject the social life conception and to accept the new, Christian conception of life, which is offered to him, and which solves all the contradictions and removes the sufferings of his life. And this time has now come. To us, who thousands of years ago experienced the transition from the animal, personal life conception to the social one, it seems that that transition was necessary and natural, and this, the one through which we have been passing these 1800 years, is arbitrary, unnatural, and terrible. But that only seems so to us because the other transition is already accomplished, and its activity has already passed into the subconscious, while the present transition is not yet accomplished, and we have to accomplish it consciously. The social life conception entered into the consciousness of men through centuries and millenniums, passed through several forms, and has now passed for humanity into the sphere of the subconscious, which is transmitted through heredity, education, and habit. And so it seems natural to us. But 5,000 years ago, it seemed to men just as unnatural and terrible as now the Christian teaching seems to us in its true meaning. It now seems to us that the demands of the Christian teaching for a universal brotherhood, abolition of nationalities, absence of property, the apparently so strange non-resistance to evil, are impossible demands. But just so strange, thousands of years ago, seemed the demands, not only of the state, but also of the family, as, for example, the demand that the parents should support their children and the young the old, and that husband and wife should be true to one another. Still more strange, even senseless, seemed the political demands that the citizens should submit to the powers that be, pay taxes, go to war in the defense of their country, and so forth. It now seems to us that all such demands are simple, intelligible, natural, and have nothing mystical or even strange about them, but 5,000 or 3,000 years ago, these demands seemed impossible. The social life conception served as a basis for religions for the very reason that, when it manifested itself to men, it seemed to them quite unintelligible, mystical, and supernatural. Now, since we have outlived this phase of the life of humanity, we understand the rational causes of the union of men in families, communes, states. But in antiquity, the demands for such a union were manifested in the name of the supernatural, and were confirmed by it. The patriarchal religion deified the families, races, nations. The political religions deified kings and states. Even now, the majority of the men of little culture, such as our peasants, who call the Tsar an earthly god, submit to the social laws, not from a rational consciousness of their necessity, not because they have a conception of the idea of the state, but from a religious sentiment. Even so now the Christian teaching represents itself to the men of the social, or pagan, world conception in the form of a supernatural religion, whereas in reality there is in it nothing mysterious, or mystical, or supernatural. It is nothing but the teaching about life, which corresponds to that stage of the material development, to that age in which humanity is, and which must therefore inevitably be accepted by it. The time will come, and is already at hand, when the Christian foundations of life, equality, brotherhood of men, community of possession, non-resistance to evil, will become as natural and as simple as the foundations of the family, the social, and the political life now appear to us. Neither man nor humanity can in their motion turn back. The social, family, and political life conceptions have been outlived by men, and it is necessary to go ahead and accept the higher life conception, which indeed is being done now. This motion takes place from two sides, consciously, in consequence of spiritual causes, and unconsciously, in consequence of material causes. Just as the individual seldom changes his life merely in accordance with the indications of reason, but as a rule, in spite of the new meaning and the new aims indicated by reason, continues to live his former life and changes it only when his life becomes entirely contradictory to his consciousness and, therefore, agonizing. So also humanity, having come through its religious guides to know the new meaning of life, the new aims, toward which it must tend, even after this knowledge continues. For a long time, in the case of the majority of men, to live the previous life, and is guided to the acceptance of a new life conception only through the impossibility of continuing the former life. In spite of the demands for the change of life, as cognized and expressed by the religious guides and accepted by the wisest men, the majority of men, in spite of the religious relation to these guides, that is, the faith in their teaching, continue in the more complex life to be guided by the previous teaching, just as a man of a family would act if, knowing how he ought to live at his age, he should from habit and frivolity continue to live a child's life. It is this that takes place in the matter of the transition of humanity from one age to another, such as is now going on. Humanity has outgrown its social, political age and has entered upon a new one. It knows the teaching which ought to be put at the foundation of the life of this new age, but from inertia continues to hold on to the previous forms of life. From this lack of correspondence between the life conception and the practice of life, there arises a series of contradictions and sufferings which poison our life and demand its change. We need only to compare the practice of life with its theory, in order that we may be frightened at the crying contradiction of the conditions of life and of our consciousness in which we live. Our whole life is one solid contradiction to everything we know and consider necessary and right. This contradiction is in everything, in the economic, the political, the international life. As though forgetting what we know, and for a time putting aside what we believe in, we cannot help but believe, because this constitutes our only foundations of life. We do everything contrary to what our conscience and our common sense demand of us. In economic, political, and international relations, we are guided by those foundations which were useful to men 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, and which directly contradict our present consciousness and those conditions of life in which we now are. It was well enough for a man of antiquity to live amidst a division of men into slaves and masters, when he believed that this division was from God, and that it could not be otherwise. But is a similar division possible in our day? A man of the ancient world could consider himself in the right to use the benefits of this world to the disadvantage of other men, causing them to suffer for generations, because he believed that men are born of various breeds, noble and base, of the generation of Japheth and of Ham. Not only the greatest sages of the world, the teachers of humanity, Plato, Aristotle, justified the existence of slaves and proved the legality of it, but even 3 centuries ago, men who wrote of the imaginary society of the future, of utopia, could not imagine it without slaves. The men of antiquity, and even of the Middle Ages, believed firmly that men are not equal, that only the Persians, only the Greeks, only the Romans, only the French were real men. But those men who in our time champion aristocratism and patriotism do not believe, cannot believe in what they say. We all know, and we cannot help but know, even if we have never heard or read this thought clearly expressed and have never expressed it ourselves, we, having imbibed this consciousness, which is born in the Christian atmosphere, know with our whole heart. And we cannot help but know that fundamental truth of the Christian teaching, that we all are the sons of one Father, all of us, no matter where we may live or what language we may speak, that we are all brothers and are subject only to the law of love, which by our common Father is implanted in our hearts. No matter what the manner of thought and degree of culture of a man of our time may be he a cultured liberal of any shade whatever, be he a philosopher of any camp, be he a scientific man, an economist of any school, be he an uncultured, even a religious man of any confession of faith, every man of our time knows that all men have the same right to life and to the benefits of this world, that no man is better or worse than anyone else, that all men are equal. Everybody knows this with absolute certainty and with his whole being, and at the same time not only sees all about him the division of men into 2 castes, one, which is working, is oppressed, in need, in suffering, and the other, idle, oppressing. And living in luxury and pleasure, he not only sees this, but involuntarily from one side or another takes part in this division of men, which his reason rejects, and he cannot help but suffer from the consciousness of such a contradiction and from participation in it. Be he master or slave, a man of our time cannot help but experience a constant agonizing contradiction between his consciousness and reality, and sufferings which arise from it. The working masses, the great majority of people, suffering from the constant, all-absorbing, senseless, dawnless labor and sufferings, suffer most of all from the consciousness of the crying contradiction between what exists and what ought to be. as the result of everything which is professed by them and by those who have placed them in this position and maintain them in it. They know that they are in slavery and are perishing in want and darkness in order to serve the lust of the minority, which keeps them in slavery. They know this and give expression to it. And this consciousness not only increases their sufferings, but even forms the essence of their sufferings. The ancient slave knew that he was a slave by nature, but our workman, feeling himself to be a slave, knows that he should not be a slave, and so experiences the torments of Tantalus, eternally wishing for and not receiving what not only could, but even should be. The sufferings of the working classes, which result from the contradiction between what is and what ought to be, are increased tenfold by the envy and hatred which result from them. A workman of our time, even though his work may be lighter than that of an ancient slave, and he may have attained an 8-hour workday and a wage of $3 per day, will not cease suffering, because, in manufacturing articles which he will not make use of, and working, not for himself and at his pleasure, but from necessity, for whims of luxurious and idle people in general, and for the enrichment of one man, the rich owner of the factory or plant, in particular, he knows that all this is taking place in a world in which not only they have accepted the scientific proposition that only work is wealth, that the exploitation of other men's labor is unjust, illegal, amenable to punishment by law, but also they profess Christ's teaching, according to which all are brothers, and a man's worth and merit consists only in serving his neighbor, and not in making use of him. He knows all this, and he cannot help but suffer torments from this crying contradiction between what ought to be and what actually exists. From all the data and from everything which I know all men profess, the laboring man says to himself, I ought to be free, equal to all other men, and loved. But I am a slave, I am humiliated and hated. And he himself hates and seeks for means to save himself from this position, to throw off his foe, who is pressing down on him, and himself to get on top of him. They say, the working men are not right in their desire to take the place of the capitalists, nor the poor in their desire to take the place of the rich. This is not true. The working men and the poor would be in the wrong if they wished for it in a world in which slaves and masters, the rich and the poor, are established by God, but they wish for it in a world in which is professed the gospel teaching. The first proposition of which is the filial relation of men to God, and so the brotherhood and equality of all men. And no matter how much men may try, it is impossible to conceal the fact that one of the first conditions of a Christian life is love, not in words, but in work. In a still greater contradiction and in still greater sufferings lives the man of the so-called cultured class. Every such man, if he believes in anything, believes, if not in the brotherhood of men, at least in humanitarianism, if not in humanitarianism, at least in justice, if not in justice, at least in science. And with all that knows that his whole life is built on conditions which are quite the reverse of all that, of all the tenets of Christianity and humanity and justice and science. He knows that all the habits in which he is brought up, and the deprivation of which would be a torment for him, can be gratified only by the painful, often perilous labor of oppressed working men, that is, by the most palpable, coarse violation of those principles of Christianity, humanitarianism, justice, and even science. I mean the demands of political economy, which he professes. He professes the principles of brotherhood, humanitarianism, justice, science, and yet lives in such a way that he needs that oppression of the laboring men which he denies, and even in such a way that his whole life is an exploitation of this oppression. And not only does he live in this way, but also he directs his activity to the maintenance of this order of things, which is directly opposed to everything in which he believes. We are all brothers, and yet every morning my brother or my sister carries out my chamber pot. We are all brothers, and I need every morning my cigar, sugar, a mirror, and so forth, objects in the manufacture of which my brothers and my sisters, who are my equals, have been losing their health, and I employ these articles and even demand them. We are all brothers, and I live by working in a bank or in a business house or a shop in order to make all the wares which my brothers need more expensive for them. We are all brothers, and yet I live by receiving a salary for arraigning, judging, and punishing a thief or a prostitute whose existence is conditioned by the whole composition of my life, and who, I know myself, ought not to be punished, but corrected. We are all brothers, and I live by receiving a salary for collecting the taxes from poor working men to be used for the luxury of the idle and the rich. We are all brothers, and I receive a salary for preaching to people what is supposed to be the Christian religion, in which I do not believe myself, and which deprives them of the possibility of finding out the real faith. I receive a salary as a priest, a bishop, for deceiving people in what is the most important matter for them. We are all brothers, but I give to the poor my pedagogical, medical, literary labors for money only. We are all brothers, but I receive a salary for preparing myself to commit murder, studying how to kill, or making a gun, powder, fortresses. The whole life of our higher classes is one solid contradiction, which is the more agonizing, the more sensitive man's conscience is. The man with a sensitive conscience cannot help but suffer if he lives this life. There is one means by which he can free himself from this suffering. It consists in drowning his conscience. But even if such men succeed in drowning their conscience, they cannot drown their terror. Insensitive people of the higher, the oppressing classes, and those who have drowned their consciences, if they do not suffer from their consciences, suffer from fear and hatred. Nor can they help but suffer. They know of that hatred against them which exists, and cannot help but exist, among the laboring classes, and they know that the working men know that they are deceived and outraged, and they are beginning to organize for the purpose of throwing off the oppression and retaliating upon the oppressors. The higher classes see the unions, strikes, the 1st of May, and they feel the calamity which is threatening them, and this terror poisons their life. They feel the calamity which is threatening them, and the terror which they experience passes into a feeling of self-defense and hatred. They know that if they weaken for a moment in their struggle with the slaves oppressed by them, they will themselves perish, because the slaves are enraged, and this rage is growing with every day of the oppression. The oppressors cannot stop oppressing, even if they should wish to do so. They know that they themselves will perish the moment they stop or even weaken in their oppressions. And they do oppress, in spite of their seeming concern for the welfare of the laboring people, for an 8-hour day, for the prohibition on employing children and women, for pensions and rewards. All this is a deception or a provision for eliciting work from the slave, but the slave remains a slave, and the master, who could not live without the slave, is less than ever prepared to free him. The ruling classes are, in relation to the workingmen, in the position of a man who is astride a man whom he holds down and does not let go of, not so much because he does not want to let go of him, as because he knows that he need but for a moment let go of the subdued man, and the subdued man will cut his throat, because the subdued man is enraged and has a knife in his hand. And so, whether they be sensitive or not, our wealthy classes cannot enjoy the good things which they have taken from the poor, as the ancients did, who believed in their right. Their whole life and all their pleasures are poisoned by rebukes of conscience or by terror. Such is the economical contradiction. More striking still is the political contradiction. All men are above all else educated in the habits of obedience to the laws of the state. The whole life of the men of our time is determined by the law of the state. A man marries or gets a divorce, educates his children, even professes a faith, in many states, in accordance with the law. What is this law, which determines the whole life of men? Do the men believe in this law? Do they consider it to be true? Not in the least. In the majority of cases, the men of our time do not believe in the justice of this law, despise it, and yet obey it. It was all very well for the men of antiquity to carry out their laws. They believed firmly that their law, which for the most part was also religious, was the one true law which all men must obey. But we know, and we cannot help but know, that the law of our state is not only not the one eternal law, but that it is only one of many laws of various countries, equally imperfect, and frequently and palpably false and unjust, and widely discussed in the newspapers. It was all very well for a Jew to submit to his laws, when he had no doubt but that they were written by God's finger, or for a Roman, when he thought that the nymph Egeria had written his laws, or even when they believed that the kings who gave the laws were the anointed of the Lord, or even that the legislative bodies had a desire to find the best laws and were able to do so. But we know how laws are made. We have all been behind the scenes. We all know that laws are the results of greed, deception, the struggle of parties, that in them there is, and there can be no true justice. And so the men of our time cannot believe that obedience to civil or political laws would satisfy the demands of the rationality of human nature. Men have known for a long time that it is not sensible to obey a law of the correctness of which there can be any doubt, and so they cannot help but suffer if they obey a law the rationality and obligatoriness of which they do not acknowledge. A man cannot help but suffer when his whole life is determined in advance by laws which he must obey under the menace of punishment, and in the rationality and justice of which he does not believe, and the unnaturalness, cruelty, injustice of which he clearly recognizes. We recognize the uselessness of custom houses and import duties, and we must pay the duties. We recognize the uselessness of the expenses for the support of royal courts and many governmental offices. We recognize the harmfulness of the church propaganda, and we must contribute to the support of these institutions. We recognize the cruelty and unscrupulousness of the penalties imposed by courts of justice, and we must take part in them. We recognize the irregularity and harmfulness of the distribution of land ownership, and we must submit to it. We do not recognize the indispensableness of armies and of war, and must bear terrible burdens for the maintenance of armies and the waging of wars, and so forth. But these contradictions are as nothing in comparison with the contradiction which has now arisen among men in their international relations, and which, under threat of ruining both human reason and human life, demands a solution. This is the contradiction between the Christian conscience and war. We are all Christian nations who live the same spiritual life, so that every good, fruitful thought, which springs up in one corner of the earth, is at once communicated to the whole Christian world, evoking similar sensations of joy and pride. Independently of nationality, we, who not only love the thinkers, benefactors, poets, scholars of other nations, but also pride ourselves on the exploit of a Damien, as though it were our own. We, who just love the men of other nationalities, the French, the Germans, the Americans, the English. We, who not only respect their qualities, but rejoice when we meet them, who give them a smile of recognition, who not only could not regard a war with them as something to be proud of, but who could not even think without horror that any disagreement may arise between these men and us. We are all called to take part in murder, which must inevitably take place, tomorrow, if not today. It was all very well for a Jew, a Greek, a Roman not only to defend the independence of his nation by means of murder, but by the means of murder also to cause other nations to submit to him, for he believed firmly that his nation was the one true, good, kind nation which was loved by God, and that all the other nations were Philistines, barbarians. Even the men of the Middle Ages and the men of the end of the last and the beginning of this century could have believed so. But we, no matter how much we may be teased to do so, can no longer believe in this, and this contradiction is so terrible for the men of our time that it is impossible to live if we do not destroy it. We live in a time which is full of contradictions. Count Komarovsky, professor of international law, writes in his learned treatise, "In the press of all countries there is constantly shown a universal tendency toward peace, toward its necessity for all nations. In the same sense express themselves the representatives of governments, as private individuals and as official organs, in parliamentary debates, in diplomatic exchanges of opinion, and even in international treaties. At the same time, however, the governments annually increase the military forces of their countries, impose new taxes, make loans, and leave to future generations as a legacy the obligation to bear the blunders of the present senseless politics." What a crying contradiction between words and deeds. Of course, the governments, to justify these measures, point to the exclusively defensive character of all these expenditures and armaments, but nonetheless it remains a puzzle for every unbiased man whence we are to expect attacks, since all the great powers unanimously in their politics pursue the one aim of defense. In reality, this looks as though each of these powers waited every moment to be attacked by another, and these are the consequences: universal distrust and a preternatural endeavor of one power to surpass the force of the others. Such an emulation in itself increases the danger of war. The nations cannot for any length of time stand the intensified arming, and sooner or later will prefer war to all the disadvantages of the present condition and constant menace. Thus, the most insignificant cause will be sufficient to make the fire of a universal war flame up in the whole of Europe. It is incorrect to think that such a crisis can cure us of the political and economical calamities which oppress us. Experience from the wars which have been waged in recent years teaches us that every war has only sharpened the hostility of the nations, increased the burden and the unendurability of the pressure of militarism, and made the politico-economic condition of Europe more hopeless and complex. Modern Europe keeps under arms an active army of 9 millions of men, writes Enrico Ferri, and 15 millions of reserves, expending on them 4 milliards of francs per year. By arming itself more and more, it paralyzes the sources of the social and the individual welfare, and may easily be compared to a man who, to provide himself with a gun, condemns himself to anemia, at the same time wasting all his strength for the purpose of making use of the very gun with which he is providing himself, and under the burden of which he will finally fall. The same was said by Charles Butt, 22, in his speech which he delivered in London before the Association for the Reform and Codification of the Law of Nations, July 26, 1887. After pointing out the same 9 millions and over of the active armies and 17 millions of reserves, and the enormous expenses of the governments for the support of these armies and equipments, he says, "But this forms only a small part of the actual cost, for besides the figures mentioned which constitute merely the war budgets of the nations, we have to take into account the enormous loss to society by the withdrawal of so many able-bodied men from the occupations of productive industry, together with the prodigious capital invested in all warlike preparations and appliances, and which is absolutely unproductive. One necessary result of the expenditure on wars and preparations for war is the steady growth of national debts. The aggregate national debts of Europe, by far the larger proportion of which has been contracted for war purposes, amount at the present time to £4,680,000,000. The same Komorowski says in another place, "We are living in a hard time. Everywhere do we hear complaints as to the slackness of business and industry, and in general as to the bad economic conditions. People point out the hard conditions of the life of the laboring classes and the universal impoverishment of the masses. But in spite of it, the governments, in their endeavor to maintain their independence, reach the extreme limits of madness. Everywhere they invent new taxes and imposts, and the financial oppression of the nations knows no limits. If we look at the budgets of the European states for the last 100 years, we shall first of all be struck by their constantly progressive and rapid growth. How can we explain this extraordinary phenomenon, which sooner or later threatens us with inevitable bankruptcy? This is incontestably due to the expenditures caused by the maintenance of an army, which swallow 1/3 and even 1/2 of the budgets of the European states. What is most lamentable in connection with it is this, that no end can be foreseen to this increase of the budgets and impoverishment of the masses. What is socialism, if not a protest against this abnormal condition, in which the greater part of the population of our part of the world finds itself? We ruin ourselves, says Frederick Passy, in a note read at the last Universal Peace Congress, 1890, at London, in preparing the means for taking part in the mad butcheries of the future, or in paying the interests of debts bequeathed to us by the mad and culpable butcheries of the past. We die of starvation in order to be able to kill one another off." Farther on, speaking of how France looks upon the subject, he says, "We believe that 100 years after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, it is time to recognize the rights of nations and to renounce forever all these enterprises of force and violence, which, under the name of conquests, are real crimes against humanity, and which, whatever the ambition of the sovereigns or the pride of the races, weaken even those who seem to profit from them. I am always very much surprised at the way religion is carried on in this country," says Sir Wilfrid Lawson at the same Congress. "You send a boy to the Sunday school, and you tell him, 'My dear boy, you must love your enemies. If any boy strikes you, don't strike him again. Try to reform him by loving him. Well, the boy stays in the Sunday school till he is 14 or 15 years of age, and then his friends say, "Put him in the army." What has he to do in the army? Why, not to love his enemies, but whenever he sees an enemy to run him through the body with a bayonet. That is the nature of all religious teaching in this country. I do not think that that is a very good way of carrying out the precepts of religion. I think if it is a good thing for the boy to love his enemy, it is a good thing for the man to love his enemy. And farther, the nations of Europe keep somewhere about 28 million of armed men to settle quarrels by killing one another, instead of by arguing. That is what the Christian nations of the world are doing at this moment. It is a very expensive way also, for this publication which I saw made out that since the year 1872 these nations had spent the almost incredible amount of £1,500,000,000 of money in preparing and settling their quarrels by killing one another. Now it seems to me that with that state of things one of two positions must be accepted, either that Christianity is a failure or that those who profess to expound Christianity have failed in expounding it properly. Until our ironclads are withdrawn and our army disbanded, we are not entitled to call ourselves a Christian nation, says Mr. J. Jowett Wilson. In a discussion which arose in connection with the question of the obligatoriness of Christian pastors to preach against war, Reverend G. D. Bartlett said, among other things, "If I understand the scriptures, I say that men are only playing with Christianity when they ignore this question, that is, say nothing about war. I have lived a longish life, I have heard many sermons, and I can say without any exaggeration that I never heard universal peace recommended from the pulpit half a dozen times in my life. Some 20 years ago, I happened to stand in a drawing room where there were 40 or 50 people, and I dared to moot the proposition that war was incompatible with Christianity. They looked upon me as an arrant fanatic. The idea that we could get on without war was regarded as unmitigated weakness and folly. In the same sense spoke the Catholic Abbé de Fourny. One of the first precepts of this eternal law which burns in the consciences of men is the one which forbids taking the life of one's like, shedding human blood without just cause and without being constrained by necessity. It is one of those laws which are most indelibly engraved in the human heart. But if it is a question of war, that is, of the shedding of human blood in torrents, the men of the present do not trouble themselves about a just cause. Those who take part in it do not think of asking themselves whether these innumerable murders are justified or not, that is, if the wars, or what goes by that name, are just or iniquitous, legal or illegal, permissible or criminal, whether they violate, or not, the primordial law which prohibits homicide and murder without just cause. But their conscience is mute in this matter. War has ceased for them to be an act which has anything to do with morality. They have no other joy in the fatigue and perils of the camp than that of being victorious, and no other sadness than that of being vanquished. Do not tell me that they serve their country. A long time ago, a great genius told you these words, which have become proverbial: reject justice, and what are the empires but great societies of brigands? And are not a band of brigands themselves small empires? Brigands themselves have certain laws or conventions by which they are ruled. There, too, they fight for the conquest of booty and for the honor of the band. The principle of the institution, he is talking of the establishment of an international tribunal, is this, that the European nations should stop being a nation of thieves, and the armies gangs of brigands and of pirates, and, I must add, of slaves. Yes, the armies are gangs of slaves, slaves of one or two rulers or one or two ministers, who dispose of them tyrannically, without any other guarantee we know than a nominal one. What characterizes the slave is this, that he is in the hands of his master like a chattel, a tool, and no longer a man. Just so it is with a soldier, an officer, a general, who march to murder and to death without any care as to justice, by the arbitrary will of ministers. Thus, military slavery exists, and it is the worst of slaveries, particularly now, when by means of enforced military service it puts the chain about the necks of all free and strong men of the nations, in order to make of them tools of murder, killers by profession, butchers of human flesh, for this is the only opus serval for which they are chained up and trained. rulers, to the number of 2 or 3, united into a secret cabinet, deliberate without control and without minutes which are intended for publicity, consequently without any guarantee for the conscience of those whom they send out to be killed. The protests against the heavy arming do not date from our day, says Senior E. T. Moneta. Listen to what Montesquieu wrote in his time. France, you may substitute the word Europe, will be ruined by the military. A new malady has spread through Europe. It has infected our princes and has made them keep a disproportionate number of troops. It has its exacerbations, and it necessarily becomes contagious, because as soon as one state increases what it calls its troops, the others suddenly increase theirs, so that nothing is gained by it but the common ruin. Every monarch keeps on a war footing all the troops which he might need in case his people were in danger of being exterminated, and this state of tension, of all against all, is called peace. As a result, Europe is so ruined that if private individuals were in the condition in which the powers are in this part of the world, the richest of them would not have anything to live on. We are poor with the riches and the commerce of the whole universe. This was written almost 150 years ago. The picture seems to be made for today. One single thing has changed: the system of government. In the time of Montesquieu, and also afterward, they used to say that the cause for the maintenance of great armies lay in the absolute kings, who waged war in the hope of finding in the conquest the means for enriching their private budgets and passing down to history in the aureole of glory. Then they said, "Oh, if the peoples could choose themselves those who have the right to refuse the government soldiers and money, for then the politics of war would come to an end." We have today representative governments in nearly all of Europe, and nonetheless the expenditures for war and for its preparation are increased in a frightful proportion. Evidently, the folly of the princes has passed down to the governing classes. At the present time, they no longer make war because a prince was disrespectful to a courtesan, as such things happened in the time of Louis XIV, but by exaggerating the respectable sentiments, like that of the national dignity and of patriotism. By exciting public opinion against a neighboring nation, there will come a day when it will be sufficient to say, though the information may not be true, that the ambassador of your government was not received by the chief of a state in order to break forth the most terrible and disastrous of wars ever seen. At the present time, Europe keeps under arms more soldiers than there were in the time of Napoleon's great wars. All citizens, with few exceptions, are obliged on our continent to pass several years in the barracks. They build fortresses, construct arsenals and ships, constantly manufacture arms, which after a while have to be replaced by others, because science, which ought always to be directed toward the well-being of men, unfortunately lends its aid to works of destruction, invents at every instant new engines for killing great masses of men as rapidly as possible. And in order to maintain so many soldiers and to make such vast preparations for murder, they spend yearly hundreds of millions, that is, what would be sufficient for the education of the people, for the execution of the greatest works of public utility, and would furnish the means for solving pacifically the social question. Europe, therefore, finds itself, in spite of the scientific conquests, in a condition as though it were still living in the worst times of the ferocious Middle Ages. All men complain of the situation, which is not yet war, but which is not peace either, and everybody would like to get out of it. The chiefs of governments protest that they want peace, and it is a matter of emulation between them as to who will make the most solemn pacific declarations. But on the same day, or the day following, they present to the legislative chambers propositions for increasing the standing army, and they say that it is for the purpose of maintaining and assuring peace that they take so many precautions. But it is not the kind of peace we like, nor are the nations deceived. True peace has reciprocal confidence for its basis, while these enormous preparations betray a profound distrust, if not a concealed hostility, between the states. What would we say of a man who, wishing to prove his sentiments of friendship for his neighbor, should invite him to discuss some question with him, while he himself is holding a revolver in his hand? It is this flagrant contradiction between the pacific declarations and the warlike policy of the governments that all good citizens want to see stopped at any price and as quickly as possible. They marvel why annually 60,000 suicides are committed in Europe, and those only the ones that are recorded, which excludes Russia and Turkey, But what we ought to marvel at is not that there are so many suicides, but so few. Every man of our time, if he grasps the contradiction between his consciousness and his life, is in a very desperate condition. To say nothing of all the other contradictions between life and consciousness, which fill the life of a man of our time, the contradiction between this last military condition, in which Europe is, and the Christian profession of Europe is enough to make a man despair, doubt the rationality of human nature, and put an end to his life in this mad and beastly world. This contradiction, the military contradiction, which is the quintessence of all others, is so terrible that a man can live and take part in it only by not thinking of it, by being able to forget it. How is this? We are all Christians. We not only profess love of one another, but actually live one common life. The pulse of our life beats with the same beats. We aid one another, learn from one another, more and more approach one another, for a common joy. In this closer union lies the meaning of the whole of life, and tomorrow some maddened head of a government will say something foolish, another man like him will answer him, and I shall go, making myself liable to be killed, to kill men who not only have done me no harm, but whom I love. And this is not a distant accident, but what we are preparing ourselves for, and it is not only a possible, but even an inevitable event. It is enough to understand this clearly in order to lose our mind and shoot ourselves. And it is precisely what happens with special frequency among the military. We need but think for a moment in order that we may come to the necessity of such an ending. It is only thus that we can explain that terrible tension with which the men of our time incline to intoxicate themselves with wine, tobacco, opium, cards, the reading of newspapers, traveling, all kinds of spectacles and amusements. All these things are done like serious, important affairs. They are indeed important affairs. If there existed no external means for dimming their consciences, one half of the men would at once shoot themselves, because to live contrary to one's reason is a most intolerable state, and all men of our time are in such a state. All men of our time live in a constant crying contradiction between consciousness and life. These contradictions are expressed in the economic and political relations, but most startling is this contradiction between the recognition of the law of the brotherhood of men, as professed by Christians, and the necessity, in which all men are placed by the universal military service, of being prepared for hostility, for murder, of being at the same time a Christian and a gladiator. Chapter 6. The removal of the contradiction between life and consciousness is possible in two ways, by a change of life or by a change of consciousness, and in the choice of one of the two there can be no doubt. A man may stop doing what he considers bad, but he cannot stop considering bad what is bad. Even so, the whole of humanity may stop doing what it considers bad, but is powerless, not only to change, but even for a time to retard the all-elucidating and expanding consciousness of what is bad and what, therefore, ought not to be. It would seem that the choice between the change of life and that of the consciousness ought to be clear and above doubt. And so, it would seem, it is indispensable for the Christian humanity of our time to renounce the pagan forms of life, which it condemns, and to build up its life on the Christian foundations which it professes. But so it would be if there did not exist the law of inertia, which is as invariable in the lives of men and nations as in inanimate bodies, and which is for men expressed by the psychological law, so well stated in the Gospel with the words, "Men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." This law consists in this, that the majority of men do not think in order to know the truth, but in order to assure themselves that the life which they lead, and which is agreeable and habitual to them, is the one which coincides with the truth. Slavery was contrary to all the moral principles which were preached by Plato and Aristotle, and yet neither the one nor the other saw this, because the negation of slavery destroyed all that life which they lived. The same happens in our world. The division of men into two castes, like the violence of the state and of the army, is repugnant to all those moral principles by which our world lives, and at the same time the leading men of culture of our time do not seem to see it. The majority, if not all, of the cultured people of our time unconsciously try to maintain the previous social concept of life which justifies their position, and to conceal from themselves and from men its inadequacy, and, above all, the necessity of the condition of the Christian life conception, which destroys the whole structure of the existing life. They strive to maintain the orders that are based on the social life conception, but themselves do not believe in it, because it is obsolete, and it is impossible to believe in it any longer. All literature, the philosophic, the political, and that of the belles lettres of our time is striking in this respect. What a wealth of ideas, forms, colors, what erudition, elegance, abundance of thoughts, and what total absence of serious contents, and even what fear of every definiteness of thought and of its expression. Circumlocutions, allegories, jests, general, extremely broad reflections, and nothing simple, clear, pertinent to the matter, that is, to the question of life. But it is not enough that they write and say graceful vapidities. They even write and say abominable, vile things. They in the most refined manner adduce reflections which take men back to primeval savagery, to the foundations, not only of pagan, but even of animal life, which we outlived as far back as 5,000 years ago. It can, indeed, not be otherwise. In keeping shy of the Christian life conception, which for some impairs only the habitual order, and for others both the habitual and the advantageous order, men cannot help but return to the pagan concept of life and to the teachings which are based on them. In our time, they not only preach patriotism and aristocratism, as it was preached 2,000 years ago, but they even preach the coarsest Epicureanism, animality, with this one difference, that the men who then preached it believed in what they preached, while now the preachers themselves do not believe in what they say, and they cannot believe, because what they preach no longer has any meaning. It is impossible to remain in one place when the soil is in motion. If you do not go ahead, you fall behind. And, though it is strange and terrible to say so, the cultured people of our time, the leaders, with their refined reflections, in reality are dragging society back, not even to the pagan state, but to the state of primeval savagery. In nothing may this direction of the activity of the leading men of our time be seen so clearly as in their relation to the phenomenon in which in our time the whole inadequacy of the social concept of life has been expressed in a concentrated form, in their relation to war, to universal armaments, and to universal military service. The indefiniteness, if not the insincerity, of the relation of the cultured men of our time to this phenomenon is striking. The relation to this matter in our cultured society is threefold. Some look upon this phenomenon as something accidental, which arose from the peculiar political condition of Europe, and consider it corrigible, without the change of the whole structure of life, by means of external, diplomatic, international measures. Others look upon this phenomenon as upon something terrible and cruel, but inevitable and fatal, like a disease or death. Others again calmly and coolly look upon war as an indispensable, beneficent, and therefore desirable phenomenon. These people look differently at the matter, but all of them discuss war as an incident which is quite independent of the will of men who take part in it, and so do not even admit that natural question, which presents itself to every simple man: must I take part in it? According to the opinion of all these men, these questions do not even exist, and every person, no matter how he himself may look upon war, must in this respect slavishly submit to the demands of the government. The relation of the first, of those who see a salvation from wars and diplomatic, international measures, is beautifully expressed in the result of the last Congress of Peace in London, and in an article and letters concerning war by prominent authors in number 8 of the Revue de Reviews for 1891. Here are the results of the Congress. Having collected the personal or written opinions from learned men all over the world, the Congress began by a Te Deum in the cathedral and ended with a dinner with speeches. Having for the period of 5 days listened to a large number of speeches, and having arrived at the following resolutions. 1. The Congress affirms its belief that the brotherhood of man involves as a necessary consequence a brotherhood of nations, in which the true interests of all are acknowledged to be identical. 2. The Congress recognizes the important influence which Christianity exercises upon the moral and political progress of mankind, and earnestly urges upon ministers of the gospel and other teachers of religion and morality. the duty of setting forth those principles of peace and goodwill, and recommends that the third Sunday in December in each year be set apart for that purpose. 3. This Congress expresses its opinion that all teachers of history should call the attention of the young to the grave evils inflicted on mankind in all ages by war, and to the fact that such war has been waged, as a rule, for most inadequate causes. 4. The Congress protests against the use of military exercises in connection with the physical exercises of school, and suggests the formation of brigades for saving life rather than any of a quasi-military character. And it urges the desirability of impressing on the Board of Examiners, who formulate the questions for examination, the propriety of guiding the minds of children into the principles of peace. 5. The Congress holds that the doctrine of the universal rights of man requires that aboriginal and weaker races shall be guarded from injustice and fraud when brought into contact with civilized peoples, alike as to their territories, their liberties, and their property, and that they shall be shielded from the vices which are so prevalent among the so-called advanced races of men. It further expresses its conviction that there should be concert of action among the nations for the accomplishment of these ends. The Congress desires to express its hearty appreciation of the conclusions arrived at by the late Anti-Slavery Conference, held in Brussels, for the amelioration of the condition of the peoples of Africa. 6. The Congress believes that the warlike prejudices and traditions which are still fostered in the various nationalities and the misrepresentations by leaders of public opinion in legislative assemblies or through the press are not infrequently indirect causes of war. The Congress is therefore of opinion that these evils should be counteracted by the publication of accurate statements and information that would tend to the removal of misunderstanding among nations, and recommends to the Interparliamentary Committee the importance of considering the question of commencing an international newspaper, which should have such a purpose as one of its primary objects. 7. The Congress proposes to the Interparliamentary Conference that the utmost support should be given to every project for the unification of weights and measures of coinage, tariffs, postal and telegraphic arrangements, means of transport, etc., which would assist in constituting a commercial, industrial, and scientific union of the peoples. 8. The Congress, in view of the vast moral and social influence of woman, urges upon every woman throughout the world to sustain the things that make for peace, as otherwise she incurs grave responsibilities for the continuance of the systems of war and militarism. 9. This Congress expresses the hope that the Financial Reform Association and other similar societies in Europe and America should unite in convoking at an early date a conference to consider the best means of establishing equitable commercial relations between states by the reduction of import duties. The Congress feels that it can affirm that the whole of Europe desires peace and is impatiently waiting for the moment when it shall see the end of those crushing armaments which, under the plea of defense, become in their turn a danger, by keeping alive mutual distrust and are at the same time the cause of that economic disturbance which stands in the way of settling in a satisfactory manner the problems of labor and poverty, which should take precedence of all others. 10. The Congress, recognizing that a general disarmament would be the best guarantee of peace and would lead to the solution, in the general interest, of those questions which must now divide states, expresses the wish that a Congress of representatives of all the states of Europe may be assembled as soon as possible to consider the means of accepting a gradual general disarmament. 11. The Congress, considering the timidity of a single power or other causes might delay indefinitely the convocation of the above-mentioned Congress, is of opinion that the government which should first dismiss any considerable number of soldiers would confer a signal benefit on Europe and mankind, because it would oblige other governments, urged on by public opinion, to follow its example, and by the moral force of this accomplished fact, would have increased rather than diminished the condition of its national defense. 12. This Congress, considering the question of disarmament as well as the peace question generally, depends upon public opinion, recommends the peace societies here represented, and all friends of peace, to carry on an active propaganda among the people, especially at the time of parliamentary elections, in order that the electors should give their votes to those candidates who have included in their program peace, disarmament, and arbitration. 13. The Congress congratulates the Friends of Peace on the resolution adopted by the International American Conference at Washington in April last, by which it was recommended that arbitration should be obligatory in all controversies concerning diplomatic and consular privileges, boundaries, territories, indemnities, right of navigation, and the validity, construction, and enforcement of treaties, and in all other cases, whatever their origin, nature, or occasion, except only those which, in the judgment of any of the nations involved in the controversy, may imperil its independence. 14. The Congress respectfully recommends this resolution to the attention of the statesmen of Europe and expresses the ardent desire that treaties in similar terms be speedily entered into between the other nations of the world. 15. The Congress expresses its satisfaction at the adoption by the Spanish Senate on June 16 last of a project of law authorizing the government to negotiate general or special treaties of arbitration for the settlement of all disputes, except those relating to the independence and internal government of the states affected. Also at the adoption of resolutions to a like effect by the Norwegian Storting and by the Italian Chamber on July 11th. 16. The Congress addresses official communications to the principal religious, political, commercial, labor, and peace organizations in civilized countries, requesting them to send petitions to governmental authorities of their respective countries, praying that measures be taken for the formation of suitable tribunals for the adjudicature of international questions, so as to avoid the resort to war. 17. Seeing a. that the object pursued by all peace societies is the establishment of juridical order between nations, b. that neutralization by international treaties constitutes a step toward this juridical state, and lessens the number of districts in which war can be carried on, the Congress recommends a larger extension of the rule of neutralization and expresses the wish, a. that all treaties which at present assure to certain states the benefit of neutrality remain in force, or, if necessary, be amended in a manner to render the neutrality more effective, either by extending neutralization to the whole of the state, of which a part only may be neutralized, or by ordering the demolition of fortresses which constitute rather a peril than a guarantee of neutrality. b. that new treaties, provided they are in harmony with the wishes of the population, be concluded for establishing the neutralization of other states. 18. The subcommittee of the Congress recommends 1. That the next Congress be held immediately before or immediately after the next session of the Interparliamentary Conference and at the same place. 2. That the question of an international peace emblem be postponed sine die. 3. The adoption of the following resolution. 1. Resolved, that we express our satisfaction at the formal and official overtures of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, addressed to the highest representatives of each church organization in Christendom, inviting the same to unite with itself in a general conference, the object of which shall be to promote the substitution of international arbitration for war. 2. That this Congress, assembled in London from the 14th to the July 19th, desires to express its profound reverence for the memory of Aurelio Saffi, the great Italian jurist, a member of the Committee of the International League of Peace and Freedom, for that the memorial to the various heads of civilized states adopted by this Congress and signed by the President should so far as practicable be presented to each power by an influential deputation. 5. That the Organization Committee be empowered to make the needful verbal emendations in the papers and resolutions presented. 6. That the following resolutions be adopted. 1. A resolution of thanks to the presidents of the various sittings of the Congress. 2. A resolution of thanks to the chairman, the secretaries, and the members of the Bureau of the Congress. 3. A resolution of thanks to the conveners and members of the sectional committees. 4. A resolution of thanks to Reverend Canon Scott Holland, Reverend Dr. Reuen, and Reverend J. Morgan Gibbon for their pulpit addresses before the Congress, and that they be requested to furnish copies of the same for publication. And also to the authorities of St. Paul's Cathedral, the City Temple, and Stamford Hill Congregational Church for the use of those buildings for public services. 5. A letter of thanks to Her Majesty for permission to visit Windsor Castle. 6. and also a resolution of thanks to the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress, to Mr. Passmore Edwards and other friends who had extended their hospitality to the members of the Congress. 19. This Congress places on record a heartfelt expression of gratitude to Almighty God for the remarkable harmony and concord which have characterized the meetings of the Assembly, in which so many men and women of varied nations, creeds, tongues, and races have gathered in closest cooperation, and in the conclusion of the labors of the Congress, it expresses its firm and unshaken belief in the ultimate triumph of the cause of peace and of the principles which have been advocated at these meetings. The fundamental idea of the Congress is this, that it is necessary, in the first place, to diffuse by all means possible the conviction among men that war is very unprofitable for people and that peace is a great good, and in the second, to act upon the governments, impressing them with the superiority of the International Tribunal over wars, and, therefore, the advantages and the necessity of disarmament. To attain the first end, the Congress turns to the teachers of history, to the women, and to the clergy with the advice that the evil of war and the good of peace be preached to men on every third Sunday in December to attain the second end. The Congress addresses the governments, proposing that they disarm and substitute arbitration for war, to preach the evil of war and the good of peace to men. But the evil of war and the good of peace are so well known to men that, so long as we have known men, the best greeting has been, "Peace be with you." What need is there, then, in preaching? Not only the Christians, but all the pagans thousands of years ago knew the evil of war and the good of peace. Consequently, the advice given to the preachers of the gospel to preach on the evil of war and the good of peace on every third Sunday in December is quite superfluous. A Christian cannot help but preach this at all times, on all the days of his life. If Christians and preachers of Christianity do not do so, there must be causes for this, and so long as these causes are not removed, no advice will be effective. Still less effective can be the advice given to the governments to dismiss the armies and substitute international tribunals for them. The governments themselves know very well all the difficulty and burdensomeness of collecting and maintaining armies, and if, in spite of it, they continue with terrible efforts and tension to collect and maintain armies, they obviously cannot do otherwise, and the advice of the Congress cannot change anything. But the learned do not want to see this, and all hope to find a combination by which the governments, who produce the wars, will limit themselves. Is it possible to be freed from war? Writes a learned man in the Revue de Reviews. All admit that when it breaks loose in Europe, its consequences will be like a great incursion of the barbarians. In a forthcoming war, the existence of whole nationalities will be at stake, and so it will be sanguinary, desperate, cruel. It is these considerations, combined with those terrible implements of war which are at the disposal of modern science, that are retarding the moment of the declaration of war and are maintaining the existing temporary order of things, which might be prolonged for an indefinite time, if it were not for those terrible expenses that oppress the European nations and threaten to bring them to no lesser calamities than those which are produced by war. Startled by this idea, the men of the various countries have sought for a means for stopping or at least mitigating the consequences of the terrible slaughter which is menacing us. Such are the questions that are propounded by the Congress soon to be held in Rome and in pamphlets dealing with disarmament. Unfortunately, it is certain that with the present structure of the majority of the European states, which are removed from one another and are guided by various interests, the complete cessation of war is a dream with which it would be dangerous to console ourselves. Still, some more reasonable laws and regulations, accepted by all, in these duels of the nations might considerably reduce the horrors of war. Similarly utopian would be the hope of disarmament, which is almost impossible, from considerations of a national character, which are intelligible to our readers. This, no doubt, means that France cannot disarm previous to avenging its wrongs. Public opinion is not prepared for the adoption of projects of disarmament, and, besides, the international relations are not such as to make their adoption possible. Disarmament, demanded by one nation of another, is tantamount to a declaration of war. It must, however, be admitted that the exchange of views between the interested nations will to a certain extent aid in the international agreement and will make possible a considerable diminution of the military expenses. which now oppress the European nations at the expense of the solution of social questions, the necessity of which is felt by every state individually, threatening to provoke an internal war in the effort to avert one from without. It is possible at least to assume a diminution of the enormous expenses which are needed in connection with the present business of war, which aims at the possibility of seizing the adversary's possessions within 24 hours and giving a decisive battle a week after the declaration of war. What is needed is that states should not be able to attack other states and in 24 hours to seize the possessions of others. This practical idea was expressed by Maxime du Camp, and to this the conclusion of the article is reduced. Camp's propositions are these. 1. A diplomatic congress ought to meet every year. 2. No war can be declared sooner than 2 months after the incident provoking it. The difficulty will be to determine which incident it is that provokes the war, because with every war there are a very large number of such incidents, and it would be necessary to decide from which incident the 2 months are to be counted. 3. War cannot be declared before it is submitted to the vote of the nations preparing for it. Military action cannot begin sooner than a month after the declaration of war. War cannot be begun, must, and so forth. But who will see to it that war cannot be begun? Who will see to it that men must do so and so? Who will compel the power to wait until the proper time? All the other powers need just as much to be moderated and placed within bounds and compelled. Who will do the compelling? And how? Public opinion. But if there is a public opinion which can compel a power to wait for a given time, the same public opinion can compel the power not to begin the war at all. But, they reply to all this, we can have such a balance of forces, ponderation to forces, that the powers will support one another. This has been tried and is being tried even now. Such were the Holy Alliance, the League of Peace, and so forth. But if all should agree to it, we are told, if all should agree to it, there would be no war, and there would be no need for supreme tribunals and courts of arbitration. Arbitration will take the place of war. The questions will be decided by a court of arbitration. The Alabama question was decided by a court of arbitration. It was proposed to have the question about the Caroline Islands submitted to the arbitration of the Pope. Switzerland and Belgium and Denmark and Holland all have declared that they prefer the decisions of a court of arbitration to war. Monaco, it seems, also declared itself in this way. What is a pity is that Germany, Russia, Austria, France have not yet made such declarations. It is wonderful how men can deceive themselves. The governments will decide to submit their differences to a court of arbitration and so will disband their armies. The differences between Russia and Poland, between England and Ireland, between Austria and Bohemia, between Turkey and the Slavs, between France and Germany will be decided by voluntary consent. This is the same as though it should be proposed that merchants and bankers should not sell anything at a higher price than at what they have bought the articles, should busy themselves with the distribution of wealth without profit, and should abolish the money which has thus become useless. But commerce and the banking industry consist in nothing but selling at a higher price than that at which the purchases are made, and so the proposition that articles should not be sold except at a purchase price, and that money should be abolished, is tantamount to a proposition that they should abolish themselves. The same is true of the governments. The proposition made to the governments that no violence be used and that the differences be decided on their merits is a proposition that the government as such should abolish itself, and to this no government can consent. Learned men gather in societies. There are many such societies, more than 100 of them. Congresses are called. Lately such met at Paris and London, and one will soon meet at Rome. Speeches are made, people dine, make toasts, publish periodicals, which are devoted to the cause, and in all of them it is proved that the tension of the nations, who are compelled to support millions of troops, has reached the utmost limit, and that this armament contradicts all the aims, properties, and desires of all the nations, but that if a lot of paper is covered with writing and a lot of speeches are made, it is possible to make all people agree and to cause them not to have any opposing interests, and then there will be no war. When I was a little fellow, I was assured that to catch a bird it was just necessary to pour some salt on its tail. I went out with the salt to the birds and immediately convinced myself that if I could get near enough to pour the salt on a bird's tail, I could catch it, and I understood that they were making fun of me. It is the same that must be understood by those who read books and pamphlets on courts of arbitration and disarmament. If it is possible to pour salt on a bird's tail, this means that it does not fly and that there is no need of catching it. But if a bird has wings and does not want to be caught, it does not allow anyone to pour salt on its tail because it is the property of a bird to fly. Even so, the property of a government does not consist in being subjected, but in subjecting, and a government is a government only in so far as it is able, not to be subjected, but to subject, and so it strives to do so, and can never voluntarily renounce its power, but the power gives it the army, and so it will never give up the army and its use for purposes of war. The mistake is based on this, that learned jurists, deceiving themselves and others, assert in their books that the government is not what it is, a collection of one set of men, doing violence to another, but as science makes it out to be, a representation of the aggregate of citizens. The learned have for so long a time assured others of this fact that they have come themselves to believe in it, and they often think seriously that justice can be obligatory for the governments. But history shows that from Caesar to Napoleon, both the First and the Third, and Bismarck, the government has by its essence always been a justice-impairing force, as, indeed, it cannot be otherwise. Justice cannot be obligatory for a man or for men who keep in hand deceived men, drilled for violence, the soldiers, and by means of them rule others. And so the governments cannot agree to the diminution of the number of these drilled men who obey them and who form all their strength and significance. Such is the relation of one set of learned men to the contradiction which weighs heavily on our world, and such are the means for its solution. Tell these men that the question is only in the personal relation of every man to the moral, religious question, now standing before all, of the legitimacy and illegitimacy of his participation in the universal military service. And these savants will only shrug their shoulders and will not even deign to give you an answer or pay attention to you. The solution of the question for them consists in reading addresses, writing books, choosing presidents, vice presidents, secretaries, and meeting and talking, now in the city and now in that. From these talks and writings there will, in their opinion, come this result, that the governments will cease drafting soldiers on whom their whole power is based, but will listen to their speeches and will dismiss their soldiers, will remain defenseless, not only against their neighbors, but even against their subjects, like robbers who, having bound defenseless men, for the purpose of robbing them, upon hearing speeches about the pain caused to the bound men by the rope, should immediately set them free. But there are people who believe in it, who busy themselves with peace congresses, deliver addresses, write little books, and the governments, of course, express their sympathy with this. Let it appear that they are supporting this, just as they make it appear that they are supporting a temperance society, whereas they for the most part live by the drunkenness of the masses, just as they make it appear that they are supporting education, whereas their strength is based on ignorance, just as they make it appear that they are supporting the liberty of the Constitution, whereas their strength is based only on the absence of a Constitution, just as they make it appear that they are concerned about the betterment of the laboring classes, whereas it is on the oppression of the laborer that their existence is, just as they make it appear that they are supporting Christianity, whereas Christianity destroys every government. To be able to do this, they have long ago worked out such provisions for temperance, that drunkenness is not impaired, such provisions for education, that ignorance is not only not interfered with, but is even strengthened, such provisions for liberty and for the Constitution, that despotism is not impeded, such provisions for the laborers, that they are not freed from slavery, such Christianity as does not destroy, but maintains the governments. Now they have also added their concern about peace. The governments, simply the kings, who travel about with their ministers of their own accord deciding the questions as to whether they shall begin the slaughter of millions this year or next, know full well that their talks about peace will not keep them, whenever they feel like it, from sending millions to slaughter. The kings even listen with pleasure to these talks, encourage them, and take part in them. All this is not only harmless, but even useful to the governments in that it takes people's minds away from the most essential question as to whether each individual man who is called to become a soldier should perform the universal military service or not. Peace will soon be established, thanks to alliances and congresses and in consequence of books and pamphlets. But in the meantime go, put on uniforms, and be prepared to oppress and torture yourselves for our advantage, say the governments. And the learned authors of congresses and of writings fully agree to this. This is one relation, the most advantageous one for the governments, and so it is encouraged by all wise governments. Another relation is the tragic relation of the men who assert that the contradiction between the striving and love for peace and the necessity of war is terrible, but that such is the fate of men. These, for the most part sensitive, gifted men see and comprehend the whole terror and the whole madness and cruelty of war, but by some strange turn of mind do not see and do not look for any issue from this condition, and, as though irritating their wound, enjoy the desperate plight of humanity. Here is a remarkable specimen of such a relation to war by a famous French author, Maupassant. As he looks from his yacht at the exercises and target shooting of the French soldiers, the following ideas come to him. War. When I but think of this word, I feel bewildered, as though they were speaking to me of sorcery, of the Inquisition, of a distant, finished, abominable, monstrous, unnatural thing. When they speak to us of cannibals, we smile proudly as we proclaim our superiority to these savages. Who are the savages, the real savages? Those who struggle in order to eat those whom they vanquish, or those who struggle to kill, merely to kill? The little soldiers of the rank and file who are running down there are destined for death, like flocks of sheep, whom a butcher drives before him on the highway. They will fall in a plain, their heads cut open by a sword stroke, or their chests pierced by bullets, and these are young men who might have worked, produced, been useful. Their fathers are old and poor. Their mothers, who have loved them for 20 years and adored them as only mothers can, will learn in 6 months or, perhaps, in a year that their son, their child, their grandchild, who had been reared with so much love, was thrown into a hole, like a dead dog, after he had been eviscerated by a ball, trampled underfoot, crushed, mashed into pulp by the charges of cavalry. Why did they kill her boy, her fine boy, her only hope, her pride, her life? She does not know. Yes, why? War. To fight. To butcher. To massacre people. And today, at our period of the world, with our civilization, with the expansion of science and the degree of philosophy which we deem the human genius to have attained, we have schools in which they teach how to kill at a great distance, with perfection. A lot of people at the same time, to kill poor innocent fellows who have the care of a family and are under no judicial sentence. And what is most startling is the fact that the people do not rise against the governments. What difference is there really between the monarchies and the republics? It is most startling that society does not rise in a body and revolt at the very mention of the word war. Oh, we shall always live under the burden of the ancient and odious customs, criminal prejudices, and savage ideas of our barbarous ancestors, because we are beasts and shall remain beasts, who are dominated by instinct and do not change. Would not any other man than Victor Hugo have been disgraced if he sent forth this cry of deliverance and truth? Today force is called violence and is about to be judged. War is summoned to court. Civilization, at the instigation of the human race, institutes proceedings and prepares the great criminal brief of the conquerors and captains. The nations are coming to understand that the increase of an offense cannot be its diminution, that if it is a crime to kill, killing much cannot be an extenuating circumstance, that if stealing is a disgrace, forcible seizing cannot be a glory. Oh, let us proclaim these absolute verities. Let us disgrace war. Vain fury and indignation of a poet. War is honored more than ever. A versatile artist in these matters, a gifted butcher of men, Mr. von Moltke, one day spoke the following words to some delegates of peace. War is sacred and divinely instituted. It is one of the sacred laws of the world. It nurtures in men all the great and noble sentiments, honor, disinterestedness, virtue, courage, and, to be short, keeps men from falling into the most hideous materialism. Thus, uniting into herds of 400,000 men, marching day and night without any rest, not thinking of anything, nor studying anything, nor learning anything, nor reading anything, not being useful to a single person, rotting from dirt, sleeping in the mire, living like the brutes in a constant stupor, pillaging cities, burning villages, ruining peoples, then meeting another conglomeration of human flesh, rushing against it, making lakes of blood and fields of battered flesh, mingled with muddy and blood-stained earth and mounds of corpses, being deprived of arms or legs, or having the skull crushed without profit to anyone, and dying in the corner of a field, while your old parents, your wife, and your children are starving. That's what is called not to fall into the most hideous materialism. The men of war are the scourges of the world. We struggle against nature, against ignorance, against obstacles of every sort, in order to make our miserable life less hard. Men, benefactors, savants use their existence in order to work, to find what may help, may succor, may ease their brothers. They go with vim about their useful business, accumulate discovery upon discovery, increasing the human spirit, expanding science, giving every day a sum of new knowledge to the intelligence of man, giving everyday well-being, ease, and force to their country. War arrives. In 6 months, the generals destroy 20 years of effort, of patience, and of genius. This is what is called not to fall into the most hideous materialism. We have seen what war is. We have seen men turned into brutes, maddened, killing for the sake of pleasure, of terror, of bravado, of ostentation. Then, when law no longer exists, when law is dead, when every notion of right has disappeared, we have seen men shoot innocent people who are found on the road and who have roused suspicion only because they showed fear. We have seen dogs chained near the doors of their masters killed, just to try new revolvers on them. We have seen cows lying in the field shot to pieces, for the sake of pleasure, only to try a gun on them, to have something to laugh at. This is what is called not to fall into the most hideous materialism. To enter a country, to kill a man who is defending his home, simply because he wears a blouse and has no cap on his head, to burn the habitations of wretched people who have no bread, to smash the furniture, to steal some of it, to drink the wine which is found in the cellars, to rape the women who are found in the streets, to burn millions of dollars worth of powder, and to leave behind them misery and the cholera. This is what is called not to fall into the most hideous materialism. What have the men of war done to give evidence of even a little intelligence? Nothing. What have they invented? Cannon and guns. That is all. What has Greece left to us? Books, marbles. Is she great because she has conquered or because she has produced? Is it the invasion of the Persians that kept her from falling into the most hideous materialism? Is it the invasions of the barbarians that saved Rome and regenerated her? Was it Napoleon I who continued the great intellectual movement which was begun by the philosophers at the end of the last century? Oh, well, if the governments arrogate to themselves the right to kill the nations, there is nothing surprising in the fact that the nations now and then take upon themselves the right to do away with the governments. They defend themselves. They are right. Nobody has the absolute right to govern others. This can be done only for the good of the governed. Whoever rules is as much obliged to avoid war as a captain of a boat is obliged to avoid a shipwreck. When a captain has lost his boat, he is judged and condemned if he is found guilty of negligence or even of incapacity. Why should not the governments be judged after the declaration of a war? If the nations understood this, if they themselves sat in judgment over the death-dealing powers, if they refused to allow themselves to be killed without reason, if they made use of their weapons against those who gave them to them for the purpose of massacring, war would be dead at once. But this day will not come. The author sees all the horror of war. He sees that its cause is in this, that the governments, deceiving people, compel them to go out to kill and die without any need. He sees also that the men composing the armies might turn their weapons against the governments and demand accounts from them. But the author thinks that this will never happen and that, therefore, there is no way out of this situation. He thinks that the business of war is terrible, but that it is inevitable, and that the demands of the governments that the soldiers shall go and fight are as inevitable as death, and that, since the governments will always demand it, there will always exist wars. Thus writes a talented, sincere author who is endowed with that penetration into the essence of the matter which forms the essence of the poetical genius. He presents to us all the cruelty of the contradiction between men's conscience and their activity, and, without solving it, seems to recognize that this contradiction must exist and that in it consists the tragedy of life. Another, not less gifted author, E. Rod, describes the cruelty and madness of the present situation in still more glaring colors, and similarly, recognizing the tragical element in it, does not offer or foresee any way out of it. What good is there in doing anything? What good is there in undertaking anything? How can we love men in these troubled times, when the morrow is but a menace? Everything we have begun, our maturing ideas, our incepted works, the little good which we shall have been able to do, will it not all be carried away by the coming hurricane? Everywhere the earth is trembling under our feet, and the clouds that are gathering upon our horizon will not pass by us. Oh, if it were only the revolution, with which we are frightened, that we had to fear. As I am incapable of imagining a more detestable society than is ours, I have more mistrust than fear for the one which will succeed it. If I were to suffer from the transformation, I should console myself with the thought that the executioners of today are the victims of yesterday, and the expectation of what is better would make me put up with what is worse. But it is not this distant peril that frightens me. I see another, nearer, above all, a more cruel peril, more cruel, because it has no excuse, because it is absurd, because no good can result from it. Every day men weigh the chances of war for the morrow, and every day they are more merciless. Thought staggers before the catastrophe which appears at the end of the century as the limit of the progress of our era, but we must get used to it. For 20 years, all the forces of science have been exhausting themselves to invent engines of destruction. And soon a few cannon shots will suffice to annihilate a whole army. They no longer arm, as formerly, a few thousands of poor devils whose blood was paid for, but whole nations who go out to cut each other's throats. They steal their time, in order later more surely to steal their lives. To prepare them for the massacre, their hatred is fanned, by pretending that they are hated. And good people are tricked, and we shall see furious masses of peaceful citizens, into whose hands the guns will be placed by a stupid order, rush against one another with the ferocity of wild animals. God knows for the sake of what ridiculous incident of the border, or of what mercantile colonial interests. They will march, like sheep, to the slaughter, but knowing whither they are going, knowing that they are leaving their wives, knowing that their children will be hungry, and they will go with anxious fear, but none the less intoxicated by the sonorous, deceptive words that will be trumpeted into their ears. They will go without revolt, passive and resigned, though they are the mass and the force and could be the power, if they wished, and if they knew how to establish common sense and brotherhood in the place of the savage trickeries of diplomacy. They will go so deceived, so duped, that they will believe the carnage to be a duty and will ask God to bless their sanguinary appetites. They will go, trampling on the crops which they have sown, burning the cities which they have built, with enthusiastic songs, joyous cries, and festive music. And their sons will erect statues to those who shall have massacred them better than anyone else. The fate of a whole generation depends on the hour at which some somber politician will give the signal, which will be followed. We know that the best among us will be mowed down, and that our work will be destroyed in the germ. We know this, and we tremble from anger, and we are unable to do anything. We are caught in the net of offices and red tape, which it would take too violent an effort to break. We belong to the laws which we have called into life to protect us, but which oppress us. We are only things of this antinomian abstraction, the state, which makes every individual a slave in the name of the will of all, who, taken separately, would want the very opposite of what they are compelled to do. If it were only one generation that is to be sacrificed. But there are other interests as well. All these salaried shouters, these ambitious exploiters of the evil passions of the masses and the poor in spirit who are deceived by the sonority of words, have to such an extent envenomed the national hatreds that the war of tomorrow will stake the existence of a race, One of the elements which have constituted the modern world is menaced. He who will be vanquished must disappear morally, and, whatever it be, we shall see a force annihilated, as if there were one too many for the good. We shall see a new Europe formed on bases that are so unjust, so brutal, so bloody, so soiled with a monstrous blotch that it cannot help but be worse than that of today, more iniquitous, more barbarous, more violent. One feels oneself oppressed by a terrible discouragement. We are tossing about in a blind alley, with guns trained on us from all the roofs. Our work is that of sailors going through their last exercise before the ship goes down. Our pleasures are those of the condemned criminal, who 15 minutes before his execution is offered a choice morsel. Anguish paralyzes our thought, and the best effort of which it is capable is to calculate, by spelling out the vague discourses of ministers, by twisting the sense of the words uttered by sovereigns, by contorting the words ascribed to diplomats and reported by the newspapers at the uncertain risk of their information, whether it is tomorrow or the day after, this year or next year, that we shall be crushed. We should, indeed, seek in vain in history for a more uncertain epoch, one which is so full of anxieties. It is pointed out that the power is in the hands of those who are ruining themselves, in the hands of the separate individuals forming the mass. It is pointed out that the source of evil is in the state. It would seem clear that the contradiction of the consciousness and of life has reached the limit beyond which it is impossible to go and after which its solution must ensue. But the author does not think so. He sees in this the tragedy of human life and, having pointed out all the terror of the situation, concludes that human life must take place in this terror. Such is the second relation to war of those men who see something fatal and tragical in it. The third relation is that of men who have lost their conscience, and so their common sense and human feeling. To this class belong Moltke, whose opinion is quoted by Maupassant, and the majority of military men who are educated in this cruel superstition, who live by it, and so are often naively convinced that war is not only an inevitable, but even a useful matter. Thus, judge also non-military, so-called learned, cultured, refined people. Here is what the famous academician, Doucet, writes in the number of the Revue de Reviews in which the letters about war are collected, in reply to the editor's inquiry as to his views on war. Dear Sir, when you ask the most peaceable of academicians whether he is an advocate of war, his answer is ready in advance. Unfortunately, dear Sir, you yourself regard as a dream the peaceful thoughts which at the present time inspire our magnanimous countrymen. Ever since I have been living in the world, I have heard many private people express their indignation against this terrifying habit of international slaughter. All men recognize and deplore this evil, but how is it to be mended? People have very often tried to abolish duels. This seemed so easy. But no, all the efforts made for the attainment of this end have done no good and never will do any good. No matter how much may be said against war and against dueling at all the congresses of the world, above all arbitrations, above all treaties, above all legislations, will eternally stand man's honor, which has ever demanded dueling, and the national advantages, which will eternally demand war. I nonetheless with all my heart hope that the Congress of Universal Peace will succeed in its very grave and very honorable problem. Receive the assurance, etc. C. Doucet. The meaning is this, that men's honor demands that people should fight, and the advantages of the nations demand that they should ruin and destroy one another, and that the attempts at stopping war are only worthy of smiles. Similar is the opinion of another famous man, Jules Clertay. Dear Sir, for an intelligent man there can exist but one opinion in respect to the question of peace and war. Humanity was created that it should live, being free to perfect and better its fate, its condition by means of peaceful labor. The universal agreement, for which the Universal Congress of Peace is asking and which it preaches, may present but a beautiful dream, but it is in any case the most beautiful dream of all. Man has always before him the promised land of the future. The harvest will mature without fear of harm from grenades and cannon wheels. But, since the world is not ruled by philosophers and benefactors, it is fortunate that our soldiers protect our borders and our hearths, and that their arms, correctly aimed, appear to us, perhaps as the very best guarantee of this peace, which is so fervently loved by all of us. Peace is given only to the strong and the determined. Receive the assurance, etc. J. Clarity. The meaning of this is that it does no harm to talk of what no one intends to do and what ought not to be done at all. But when it comes to business, we must fight. Here is another recent expression of opinion concerning war by the most popular novelist of Europe, E. Zola. I consider war a fatal necessity, which appears inevitable to us in view of its close connection with human nature and the whole world structure. I wish war could be removed for the longest possible time. Nonetheless, the moment will arrive when we shall be compelled to fight. I, at the present moment, am placing myself on the universal point of view, and in no way have any reference to our difference with Germany, which presents itself only as an insignificant incident in the history of humanity. I say that war is indispensable and useful because it appears to humanity as one of the conditions of its existence. We everywhere meet with war, not only among various tribes and nations, but also in domestic and private life. It appears as one of the chief elements of progress, and every step forward, which humanity has taken, has been accompanied by bloodshed. People used to speak, and even now speak, of disarmament, but disarmament is something impossible, and even if it were possible, we should be obliged to reject it. Only an armed nation appears powerful and great. I am convinced that a universal disarmament would bring with it something like a moral fall, which would find its expression in universal impotence, and would be in the way of a progressive advancement of humanity. A martial nation has always enjoyed virile strength. Military art has brought with it the development of all the other arts. History testifies to that. Thus, in Athens and in Rome, commerce, industry, and literature never reached such development as at the time when these cities ruled over the then known world by force of arms. To take an example from times nearer to us, let us recall the age of Louis XIV. The wars of the great king not only did not retard the progress of the arts and sciences, but, on the contrary, seemed to aid and foster their development. War is a useful thing. But best of all in this sense is the opinion of the most talented writer of this camp, the opinion of the academician Vogue. Here is what he writes in an article about the exhibition in visiting the military department. In the Esplanade des Invalides, amidst exotic and colonial buildings, one structure of a more severe style rises in the picturesque bazaar. All these representatives of the terrestrial globe adjoin the palace of war. A superb subject of antitheses for humanitarian rhetorics. Indeed, it does not let pass an occasion for deploring such juxtaposition and for asserting that this will kill that the union of the nations through science and labor will conquer the martial instincts. We shall not keep it from fondling the hope of the chimera of a golden age, which, if it should be realized, would soon become an age of mire. All history teaches us that blood is needed to speed and confirm the union of the nations. The natural sciences have in our time confirmed the mysterious law which was revealed to Joseph de Maistre by the inspiration of his genius and the consideration of primitive dogmas. He saw how the world redeems its hereditary falls by a sacrifice. The sciences show us how the world is perfected by struggle and by compulsory selection. This is the assertion from two sides of the same decree, written out in different expressions. The assertion is naturally not a pleasant one, but the laws of the world are not established for our pleasure, they are established for our perfection. Let us, then, enter into this unavoidable, indispensable palace of war, and we shall have occasion to observe in what manner the most stubborn of our instincts, without losing anything of its force, is transformed in submitting to the different demands of historic moments. This idea that the proof of the necessity of war is to be found in two expressions of Maistre and Darwin, two great thinkers according to his opinion, pleases Vogue so much that he repeats it. Dear Sir, he writes to the editor of the Revue des Revues, you ask for my opinion in regard to the success of the Universal Congress of Peace. I believe, with Darwin, that a violent struggle is a law of nature by which all beings are ruled. Like Joseph de Maistre, I believe that it is a divine law, two different appellations for one and the same thing. If, past all expectation, some particle of humanity, say the whole civilized West, succeeded in arresting the action of this law, other, more primitive nations would apply it against us. In these nations, the voice of nature would vanquish the voice of human reason, and they would act with success, because the assurance of peace, I do not say peace itself, but the full assurance of peace would evoke in men corruption and fall, which act more destructively than the most terrible war. I find that for that criminal law, war, it is necessary to do the same as for all the other criminal laws, to mitigate them, to try to make them unnecessary, and to apply them as rarely as possible. But the whole of history teaches us that it is impossible to abolish these laws, so long as there are left in the world 2 men, money, and a woman between them. I should be very happy if the Congress could prove the contrary to me, but I doubt whether it will be able to overthrow history, the law of nature, and the law of God. Accept the assurance, etc. The idea is this, that history, man's nature, and God show us that, so long as there shall be 2 men and between them bread, money, and a woman, there will be war. That is, that no progress will bring men to get away from the one conception of life, where it is impossible without quarreling to divide the bread, the money. The money is very good here, and the woman. How strange the people are that assemble in congresses to talk about how to catch birds by throwing salt on their tails, though they cannot help but know that it is impossible to do so. Queer are those who, like Maupassant, Rod, and many others, see clearly the whole horror of war, the whole contradiction which arises from this, that men do not do what they ought to do, what is advantageous and necessary for them to do, deplore the tragedy of life, and do not see that all this tragedy will stop as soon as men will cease to discuss what they ought not to discuss, and will begin not to do what is painful for them to do, what displeases and disgusts them. These people are queer, but those who, like Vogue and others, professing the law of evolution, recognize war not only as unavoidable, but even as useful, and so as desirable, are strange and terrible with their moral perversion. The others at least say that they hate the evil and love the good, but these simply recognize that there is no good and no evil. All the talk about establishing peace in the place of eternal war is a harmful sentimental boast of babblers. There is a law of evolution from which it follows that I must live and act badly. What is to be done? I am an educated man, and I know the law of evolution, and so I will act badly. Entrance au palais de la guerre. There is a law of evolution, and so there is nothing bad nor good, and we must live for nothing but our personal life, leaving everything else to the law of evolution. This is the last expression of refined culture, and at the same time of that obscuring of consciousness with which all the cultured classes of our time are occupied. The desire of the cultured classes in one way or another to maintain their favorite ideas and their life, which is based upon them, has reached its utmost limits. They lie, deceive themselves and others in the most refined way, if only they can in some way obscure and drown their consciences. Instead of changing the life in accord with the consciousness, they try in every manner possible to obscure and drown their consciousness. But the light shines even in the dark, and so it is beginning to shine in our time.